You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. In this episode, you got the four-headed beast coming back at you again. We got myself, Nick. We got Theresa from the Spiritual Gangsters. We got Jin the Ninja from Threshold Saints. And we got the man himself, Headless Giant. And just to let you all know, this episode was brought to you by the Headless Giant. This was his idea, and this is his bone to pick. And I'm very interested on the topic myself. So I got the crew together. I figured, this would probably be a good topic for all four of us. So not to just make it easy for myself, but Headless, why don't you just take it away?
All right. So if we're going to talk about Christian eschatology, I think it's time to talk about some of the uncomfortable factors that revolve around Christianity in general and older Jewish myths. And I think where we need to go first is 272 BC, right? This is the start of what we know of as the Bible, right? This is the writing of the Septuagint in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, when this was written, it was called the Septuagint because it was all these books that, came together as this one document. And what they said was, this is based off of much older manuscripts. Now, what's really important to note here is that anthropology and cultural anthropology in general understands and looks at how each and every culture is layered. So the very first base layer is going to influence the layer above that. So as technology changes, as the language changes, these influences start to layer on top of themselves. And Jin can definitely identify with this because you can see it very clearly in the Asian cultures, right? You'll see that you've got a Buddhist layer. You see that you've got a polytheistic layer. Right? And all these layers kind of add up to the full culture. So this right here would be the base layer of Judaism, because until the point when you had the Septuagint written, it was kind of, you had the Elephantine Scrolls, which didn't mention any of the things that are mentioned in the Septuagint, and you had several other things. But in 272, Ptolemy II decided he was going to gather to him all of these Jewish scholars, and they were going to write down this book. Now, what we find in 272 is that a lot of things emerged, like, for instance, Moses. So in Jewish mysticism before that time, they didn't really have a Moses, but they kind of created it. And if you look at the story of Moses, it mirrors almost exactly the story of Sargon of Akkad. And Sargon of Akkad was found in a reed basket by royalty, and then he became the lawgiver for everybody, right? He became the one who created the Rosetta Stone and all the rest of these things that we found in ancient history that has to do with giving the law, right? And Sargon of Akkad was a pivotal character in that entire historical play. Now, the stories of Sargon of Akkad being picked up in the reed basket in the bulrushes wasn't necessarily true, but it was a very compelling story, and it made him a populist character because he wasn't of this royal caste. He was taken in by the royal caste, and then Akkadian language became dominant as he overcame Samaria. But he had great respect for the Sumerians, so he tried to keep the official bureaucratic language Sumerian. He spoke Akkadian. Now, there's a difference between these languages, and it represents a major moment in history that changed the shape of the Mesopotamian region. This is why they modeled this character of Moses after Sargon of Akkad, right? Because it was that pivotal of a moment that they wanted to have a character exactly like that, giving the law to the Jewish people. And so it makes sense why they would inject that into the Septuagint. Now, before the Septuagint, there really wasn't any sort of historical accounts of Moses. So they keep trying to look for, the Exodus story in ancient times, but they really can't find a group of people, calling themselves the Jews or something, exiting out of Egypt and going into the Palestinian region. And they've really, really tried hard to do that. Now, the closest they can get is this guy named Tutmosis. And Tutmosis is not the same character as Moses, but they're like, well, maybe they just embellished a little bit. But that doesn't really add to the historicity of the Bible. Another interesting thing is that it wasn't until the Septuagint that they finally had this sort of cohesive idea of monotheism, right? And so if you look at the Elephantine Scrolls, which was a military outpost of Jewish people in Egypt, in the upper part of Egypt, down by the Nile, they all had many, many gods, right? And you could see it on display that they had a altar and they had all these other factors that really didn't, jive well with the Bible, right? So they were worshiping other gods and everything else. And so there was only supposed to be one altar for the entire Jewish religion, which is at the temple. But there were lots and lots and lots of these altars scattered about. So it doesn't really match up very well with the archaeological record as to the historicity of the Bible specifically. But it does go to show exactly what the Greek influence is on these myths. So the Greeks had made several gods like Zeusamon. It's a combination of Zeus and Ammon, right? They just combine these things into one so that they can have a cohesive storyline so that they can better control people with narratives, right? So they would do this all over the region, all the places that they would settle. They would start to combine these gods in interesting ways so that the Greek culture can then dominate the other cultures. And the people who knew about this back then, including all of these Hebrew scholars that they took in, were watching this process and understood that if you can create a person's narrative, you can then control that person for the rest of their life. And this, I think, is a very important factor when it comes to understanding the Bible in this regard. Because once you can control a population's narrative and how they see themselves and how they relate to the rest of the world, it becomes a simple task of just emphasizing different parts of this narrative to get them to move in a certain way without having to use expensive violence to do so.
Expensive violence.
So from the Septuagint, you also get a lot of other characters that show up where you've got Samson, right? Which is a very clear ripoff of Heracles, right? So in the Heracles myth, he's fighting this lion and he, with his bare hands, he's fighting all these creatures. And this was a very influential character in Greek mythology because everywhere the Greeks would go, they created stories about Heracles as he conquered these beasts in these different parts of the world. It kind of gave them a sense of being able to conquer things and dominate things using this story. So anywhere the Greeks would go, somehow they find a new passage about Heracles' journeys all over the world. And they used specific number combinations with these journeys to try and influence what they created, which was Isopsephy. And Isopsephy was originally a Greek form of magic using numbers. It then became numerology, right? And so numerology was a big influence on the Septuagint. The Septuagint was called the Big G, right? Because it was the seventh letter, right? So you're starting to get where the ideas of the Big G in Freemasonry kind of come from. They're looking at the Septuagint and they're saying, wow, these guys had this ability to control people with narrative on lock. So as we're going through the Septuagint and you're seeing all of these different these characters that were pre-existing the Septuagint in 272 BC, you kind of get the idea that maybe this was a contemporary retelling of the events that went on before that. I'm not saying the Jews didn't exist before that, because clearly they had to have this scholarly work, but they were sent all to different parts of the world, right? They wanted to reconsolidate their own people into their own space and use that as a base of operations to move forward. Because at that time that the Septuagint was written, Hebrew language only had about 3,000 words, right? Because they had been decimated to such a degree that now the Hebrew language was mostly ceremonial, and it was mostly used for sacrifice and all the rest of the stuff going on at the temple. They wanted to get that back up to a functional language. And the only way that they could think to do that is by using this Koine Greek as a method of creating the narratives and then bringing it all together and then recreating this Hebrew language. We do find Proto-Hebrew in a lot of places in the United States, actually. So you find this Proto-Hebrew all sorts of other places. So I believe personally that there was a lot of contact between the North American continent and the Old World. And if you look at places like Michigan, where they've got these huge pits where they were mining copper, and you understand that the Bronze Age didn't really have the kind of mining capacity to actually have that amount of copper, mixed with zinc to create bronze, or tin to make bronze in Europe and Asia and Africa. They didn't have the mines, but there were mines in North America that have still remained unexplained to this day. It could be one of the reasons why the 10,000 mounds that were excavated are sitting in a locked vault inside the University of Michigan, and nobody's really allowed to go in there and examine all of these artifacts from these mounds, right? They're just keeping it unlocked, because why do you need to look at that? Why do you need to know about this history? We've given you the history that you're supposed to believe in, and we don't need to talk about things like North American contact prior to, the invasion, now that it's been recharacterized as an invasion instead of just like a continuation. Well, we'll go with that narrative instead. So society in general is all about narrative control. So in the Old Testament, we get several references to this Moshiach, or this Messiah character coming in the future to save the Jews, right? So there's a continuity between the Old and New Testaments in terms of how they prophesied their coming Messiah to be. Right. So you've got in Ecclesiastes, they say that 2/3 of the Jewish population have to be wiped out for Moshiach to return. And what's interesting, my dad, who's a pastor, he was over in Israel in the 1970s, and he was talking with a rabbi who said, you have to think about it from our perspective. There's 2/3 of global Jewry was wiped out in the Holocaust, which is why they've chosen the number 6 million to represent that 2/3 of Judaism that was wiped out in the Holocaust. Because in their minds, as long as they can keep repeating the same numbers that are in the Old Testament and all the rest of this eschatology, they can manufacture their Moshiach. They can get it and have it. And this is where we find ourselves today with Christian eschatology, because as we can see, we've all adopted this new form of Judaism in the West, right? Which talks about this character Jesus, and this character Jesus has the same sort of Moshiach qualities that were rejected by the Jews, but there's more to it than that, right? There's more to it than that. So we think, from the Christian background, we think, well, this guy came, he's the propitiation. He gave us, the cleansing of our sins and everything else. And so we don't need to worry about coming end times, because we've already been redeemed. So if it comes, it comes, and we don't have to do anything about it because God is in control, and we don't really need to be in control of our own destinies at this point. I think my camera went off.
No, you're good. You're good.
So we don't really need to worry about our own destinies. We've got God on our side. And so you've got over and over and over again in history, these different cults that would come up and say, Jesus is coming April 24th, 1775 or whatever, right? And then immediately they go into passivity mode and they start doing things that seem out of place. They start selling off their goods. They start, going into a mode which is not conducive for future flourishing, right? So a great example of this is in the 1840s, you've got these Millerites. And the Millerites were following this pastor who said, Jesus is coming back. I've got it on great authority. All you need to do is sell off all of your goods, and he'll be back by the end of this decade, right? And so they did, and he didn't come back. And so they had to figure out what the future had in store for them, because they had a story which caused them to go into this passive mode. And it's sort of codependence on the narratives that they've been fed their whole lives. And so Christianity ends up becoming this method of population control, because again, Christianity is the world's first globalist religion. It go into all the world and preach the gospel, right? And what they did is they inverted a lot of the symbols that came before it, right? So you've got the inversions of symbols, and then you've got the globalist nature of the thing. And if you take all of these in perspective, it's not a pretty picture. It's not a pretty picture, but it becomes a very effective tool for population control. And unfortunately, I think we're finding ourselves in that very same position today, where now all the prophecies are coming true and all of the old gods are coming back, right? That's the one thing that the Christians and the Jews fear the most, is that the old gods are returning and they are going to destroy this planet, and we're going to go into tribulation and all the rest of this stuff. And, I hate to mock it, but
it's funny. I just want to throw this in. Like, I know occultists who think that way, and I'm like, just go back to the Bible, dude. Back to the way you used to look at shit. Like, why are you into this shit if you think the old gods are going to come back and kill you? I don't know.
Right. Well, there's so many different mirrored versions of these old gods that I think they want to promote, right? So you can't have this sort of supreme deity without having the drama of the evil deity, right? And so you always have to have this interplay between the good and the evil to kind of push people in a certain direction. And this is where I get the term linear time versus cyclical time. So in linear time, all of history is moving up to a fixed point, and that fixed point represents the end of it all. And then from that point, there is no more time. We're done with that. And you see this reflected in Marxism too. They call it the end of history. When we've got nothing more to gain, nothing more to lose, everybody's equal. That's the end of history. There's never going to be any more conflicts. And this is sort of the communist ideal, which came from proto-communist roots. Did Jin pop out?
Yeah, maybe he's coming back.
So the proto-communist roots would be examining what Christianity did before the Dark Ages of, forcefully converting everybody in Europe to this new way of looking at the world based off of the inversion of symbols that came from the old world. And in a lot of ways, if you look at the groups that Rome hated, those are the same groups that this new Christian empire hated, despite the fact that these were the most devoted Christians after this conversion, right? So a good example of this would be the Goths and the Vandals. So the Goths and the Vandals were some of the first recruits into Christianity, but they were the enemies of Rome because Rome was occupied for 30 years by the Goths, and the Vandals are the first ones who invaded and basically broke the doors open. And this guy Totillus had to deal with these Roman elites who were also Christian, and they were fighting back and forth over and over again for 30 years. Now, Totillus loved Rome. He absolutely loved it. He didn't want to destroy it. He wanted to preserve it. And in fact, it wasn't until he was faced with the option of doing so, because the elites that had basically moved over to the Eastern Roman Empire kept trying to invade and starve the people of Rome to death, that he finally said, all right, fine, you guys want to destroy Rome? How about I do it for you? And he wasn't convinced until a Catholic priest said to him, do you want to be known for all the rest of history as the savior of Rome or the destroyer of Rome? And he chose he wanted to be the savior of Rome, but nobody here recognizes the name Totilas. They don't want to talk about him, because after they had left Rome, after the Goths had finally been defeated, there was a Aryan heresy, right? So this god Deus Pater, which was the god of the Scythians, right, which means God the Father, again, back to this sort of sky god elemental kind of Jupiterian idea. Deus Pater had a son, he popped out again, had a son named Jesus, right? And that's what they were telling them. Now, to the Goths, those are two separate entities. Jesus and God the Father are two separate entities. Well, Arius, the guy who came to the Goths and the Vandals and told them that, God the Father had a son, and that son came to save the world. These Aryan heresies said that all of the people who had converted under the idea that God the Father and God the Son were separate were now heretics, and they had to give up all of their gold to the Vatican and to the Eastern Roman Empire, or else be killed, be beheaded, right? Now, if you think about it, this is a very, very tiny theological problem that they elevated to a status of death sentence based off of the fact that they didn't like these guys already, right? And it only took about 10 or 20 years after they had all converted to Christianity to now declare them heretics and go in there and steal their gold. I see that happening over and over again throughout history. Now, you have to understand the Frankists were accepted into the Catholic Church, right? They were accepted into the Catholic Church because you've got to have the dichotomy between good and evil to produce the drama you need to rule. And, this goes back into the Bacchus story again, and why the Bacchus story or Dionysus is so closely related to Jesus myth, because Bacchus is twofold. He was born twice, right? Once after he died, and he came back after he'd been ripped to pieces, right? That twofold nature in him is why he is the god of drama, right? You've seen the mask that's smiling and the mask that's frowning.
Yeah.
That's a Dionysian symbol. Yeah. Because you have to have that dichotomy between the two so that you can create the drama. Now, church for the Greeks, the people who wrote the Septuagint, was the theater, right? So when we go to the theater and watch these movies, what we're really doing is engaging in the ancient church practices of the Greeks. And what they're doing by introducing you to these things, these ideas that have a dichotomy, is they're producing in your mind the type of drama they want to use to produce something of value. And I think that's why it's appropriate that he's wearing his mask today.
Yo, for sure. But let's just interject for a quick second. Like, you're saying that the Romans had the same enemy as the church? What were you saying?
So, in 550, when Rome fell, right, yeah, they fell to the Christian Goths.
Right. Okay. But prior to that, the Romans did hate the Christians for a very long time and executed
It wasn't until they saw the actual value, because the Romans were apologists for the Septuagint. They said, no, what really happened in Alexandria is 72 priests came from the Hebrews to get together, and they perfectly recited the entire Bible together. There you go. They perfectly recited the entire Bible, and they did it without missing a single word, so that's how we know it's the Word of God. So what they decided was that in the time of Constantine, that this new way of consolidating all religions into one was superior to their way of governing, which was the polytheism. So they just recognized how these different control styles differed from one another, and they chose the one that was far more centralized, because in polytheism, each town has its own god, each city has its own form of autonomy based off of their belief systems. Now that can't work under a Roman Empire, and they had been feeling that to a great extent, because one thing that's very common in polytheism that's less common in the monotheism is rebellions. All of these places had rebellions when the powers that be that were trying to run the empire would stomp all over these people. They would rise up against them. But it becomes far harder to do that if you don't have a tribal structure anymore. You only have a church structure, right? So the church is centrally managed, and that church is telling them exactly what they need to know, and they can't really organize on a familial or town basis anymore because of the fact that all of that tribalism is now invested into the church, and their belief structures are now put into the box that you control. So you have a lot of rebellions afterwards, but nowhere near as much as pre-Christian eras. Does anybody have any questions? Comments? Because I want to get into the inversions.
There was something I wanted to add that I just thought was interesting. You mentioned the Goths and the Visigoths and stuff. This is a pain in the ass. My headphones are all fucked up. I find something interesting with that, with the Goths. Hold on. These headphones are actually a real pain in the dick. It's supposed to be comfortable. Their artwork of Jesus is very different compared to other people's artwork, the Goths and the Visigoths. And I do find that interesting because, like, I've seen it depicted and seen it, like, even covered, like, on, like, documentary type things. And, I mean, they were drawing Jesus with hips and man boobs. Like, he was very androgynous. And, the reason they were going into that is because, like, they were saying how, like, they even were saying on the show that they believed that same reason Mary got pushed in areas for ISIS. You just basically had them pretty much pushing the whole Christianity idea or Jesus idea onto people and pagans who, like, really probably didn't want it but might have went along with it because they wanted to live. And like, you kind of, like, they don't necessarily, like, you're kind of almost seeing that place's flair of that idea that they've accepted, and you can see it kind of depicted a little bit differently in art, in my opinion. Like, they were even saying, like, there are a lot of reasons why they think Mary was huge in some areas is because ISIS was big, so they crammed Mary down their fucking throat to accept her. This is, it's another female. Here, take that, eat that, accept that. You know what I'm saying? So, like, you start seeing, like, in my opinion, what I'm getting at is, like, the art isn't going to be the same as everybody else's, is because they're just kind of, like, accepting that idea into their stuff. That's my opinion.
It comes from the name Catholic. Catholic means
like
universal.
Yeah.
So they have to be the universal church, which means all of the beliefs centralized into a single source.
I think it's natural, though, if you're from a certain culture, that you would adopt the belief system to reflect your culture at the same time. Like Santa Claus, you have Black Santa, you have Asian Santa. You know what I mean? Like, I don't find that, like, odd at all.
No, and it shouldn't be, because before Christianity, syncretism was a rule. It wasn't a suggestion.
You know what I think a huge problem with it is, though, is that when you start to look at how they sold these ideas, I'm saying the word sold right there, there's a problem. Like, you can tell, I think in my beliefs in certain areas, people pimped out ideas to sell it. If you need to sell it, what are you doing? You ain't a used car salesman. Just keep it moving. They don't want to hear your shit, keep it moving, because there's a fucking monetary value to getting people to believe in this shit. Just like there isn't people believing silly shit on YouTube or podcasts, because there's monetary value. People keep those stories going because it's bringing in money.
This goes into the idea of theology itself. So for me, as I'm doing this research on the Greeks, I find this goddess Thea. And Thea is the wife of Hyperion. And Hyperion is the god who gave birth to the sun and the moon and the dawn. Eos, Selene, and Helios, right? And so these gods represent the highest value in the heavens. And this goddess Thea is a root for theology. Any god word that starts with the THE is related to Thea, right? That's the goddess. And so she's the goddess of value. She's said to give intrinsic value to gold, to diamonds, to all the precious gemstones, right? And logos, or logia, theologos, right, is the reason behind that attention, right? So when you're talking about theology, it's about grasping people's attention, getting them to focus on what you're talking about. Theology is all about getting attention and keeping it.
You know, I have a question I actually want to ask all four of us, and it's just something that came up and kind of like going on with what you were saying. I don't know if this is going to work, and I'm putting us all on the spot here, but Theresa, Jin, and Headless, was there different times that you believed in maybe a different ideology or something besides what you believe in now? Have you? All right. When you moved from one thing to the next, was that probably due to your own searching, correct? It wasn't like forced on you guys. All right.
Exactly.
When you moved from one thing to the next, did you take older qualities and mix that in? Or, oh, you did. All right. I find that interesting because that's actually not for me, but I can see that. Like what I was going to say is like, all right. I guess like if I was into Greek mythology and went over into Egyptian mythology and found that more interesting, I'm not going to start taking Greek things that I liked and start saying, well, that's what Thoth is now too. No, Thoth is completely different if I want to start looking at, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, okay.
Did you do that when you switched ideologies?
Jin,
You probably see where I'm going with this, right?
I mean, Theresa, if you want to go, I mean, I don't mind.
Because people have done that. And like what I'm getting at is that would you really be bringing similarities over if it's not shoved down your throat?
I think for me, so like I was raised Catholic, right? Very traditional. But I always questioned it, right? So I explored a lot of like Eastern philosophies. I got very into yoga, Buddhism. I considered becoming a Buddhist like formally at one point. But for me, I think like I appreciate that because now I see a lot of similarities in other modalities to Christianity, to Catholicism, right? Like I can appreciate that there's hidden messages in like all the religions that are sort of pointing to the same thing. Now, will I ever renounce like my belief in Jesus personally? No. Only because for me, I think there's enough evidence for me to say, okay, no, like there's certain things about Catholicism that I can't deny are untrue for me. That's all. Yeah.
But like when you went from Buddha to Jesus.
Sure, of course. And then like even when I would practice yoga, like a lot of time there would be like, you know, the Christian influence in my mind. I wasn't I was interested in like learning about different gods, and I've always loved Greek and Roman mythology. I've always been very fascinated by it as well. So I feel like, yes, there is something to these other belief systems. You know, there's something to it for sure.
I guess when I'm trying to get at, like, even with hoodoo or voodoo, and I kind of didn't let Headless or Jen even answer either. I'm sorry, but like, it's just, I think I'm trying to get at what I'm getting at here. It's like, even with hoodoo and voodoo, I'm kind of like getting to the point already without listening to everybody else. But like, I'm sure Headless and Jim will even agree with this. A lot of people will practice and they think they're using Archangel St. Michael, and they're not. They're just doing that so the white man shuts the fuck up and leaves them alone.
Right.
So again, you look like you might be mingling, but you're not because this shit's shoved down your throat.
Did you know that Jeffrey Epstein practiced voodoo? Like he threatened several girls with voodoo curses.
I think I've heard that, yes, before. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just jump in here on the syncretism, since that is kind of my train. But I think I know what you're asking, Nick. I think you're really asking, like, what is the? I don't know if you're asking, but I think you're putting it out there. What is the core of syncretism? So something I've thought about a lot is, like, there is clearly a high IQ syncretism where cultures would take things that are what I would consider the perennial system, and they would put it back together. So you can see, like, there was 200 years where Haiti did not have any foreign-born priests. So they developed, through the French Freemasonic system, a way to train priests local to Haiti. All of those priests also belong to houses, hogans, or they were hogans or voodoo priests. So there was clearly a thing where they saw Saint Michael, and then some will say, okay, that is Ogun or the god of war or whomever they're syncretizing, because different houses have very different sort of ways to think about it. But so a good commonality is Saint Patrick. So Saint Patrick sort of for them represents their overarching higher deity, like not God, but it's close. It's like Metatron. So he is he's Damballa. So he is the sort of lord of the snakes. And people will be like, okay, well, St. Patrick, he expelled the snakes. But there's an interesting way if you look at his iconography, because he stands upon a serpent. So if you are the king of all serpents, yes, you should have serpents in your iconography. It makes total sense. And there are secret ways to also understand some of the, I guess, rituals that the snake spirits are not really invited into. I know this is getting off on a totally different tangent. I apologize. But in the Care for, so when they're doing the voodoo ritual, they will invoke on a 4-quadrant system. So those Simbi spirits, the snake spirits, that's what they call Nagas. I'm going to call them Nagas because obviously. But when they invoke the Simbi spirits, those are never invoked into the Care for. Those are never invoked into the house. It's always done in a natural setting, like a river or at the beach or at the lake, because those are too powerful of spirits. So it actually makes sense that you would have St. Patrick as the head of that family, because you don't want those spirits just to come around and do whatever they want, because they're very chaotic. So you need someone to put their feet over them, just like St. Patrick has in his iconography. So I personally think that there is kind of a way to syncretize things that aren't just forced, that aren't just like, you're just not mashing puzzle pieces together. You're using it it's like you're matching it based on deeper spiritual ideas.
I totally agree with that. But then, like, see, this is something I was going to actually say, and you really nailed it too. I was going to say that, like, if you start being eclectic, it's because you don't think that one actually has the full answer, so you have to start going other places. So then I really can't say that you'd even really be accepting that as the one true answer either. And then if it's not being eclectic, in my opinion, it's because it's being forced on you. So either way, it's not actually a true answer, is it?
Before you can have a government, you got to have a cult. That's just always.
See, but that's
answer.
the thing about
Before
cults. If you think about it, they'll have their own specific thought, which is every religion is different. This is what I'm trying to get at. It's almost like that you have to be really sold, because then if you start being eclectic because you're looking for other answers, you're not completely sold on that. You think it has value.
I think though sometimes too it's because truthfully you're not educated enough in your own faith system. I can say that's true for myself, like in my own experience. A lot of, like, say, you know, you go to typical like Catholic school or whatever, you don't learn shit there. You don't learn shit in church, neither. You have to seek that out for yourself. And that, to me, is like the issue that I see, like when I go to church, or like I see it in my kids, like, you know, attending school and stuff. I'm like, what are they even teaching you? Like, no wonder people stray and like don't understand, is because I only believe more now because I did my own diving into it. You know that's when I kind of came like full circle, and I was like, holy shit, this is really true. Like, you know,
the perfect example would be Christian Greek translations. Because they butcher the philology on purpose because they don't think anybody else is know Greek. And it's like, hold on, guys.
I think a lot of it is on purpose, honestly, even from the church level.
Yeah.
To really not educate people properly in like historical fact and like, you know, anyway, sorry.
Totally. No, you're totally right. Because like there's even stuff that I've covered on the show before. And me and Lisa have covered it, mentioned it plenty of times, numerous times. Yeah. You have people in the Catholic Church and the way that they taught stuff. Religion was one of 7 things that were put together to make a whole understanding.
Yes.
Bingo.
And when that was going on, shit was on and popping.
Yep.
No, for real. And then I don't know if something, these motherfuckers are getting too smart or something, but it all of a sudden disappeared. And I'm not trying to
You know
stick up
what
for the
that's called?
Catholic Church, but they were onto something at some point. I hate to say it. I hate to say it.
You know what that's called? You've got the trivium and the quadrivium.
Both of them put together. That's where you got the, I wasn't going to get into all that because I didn't know if everybody knew what I was going to say, but I mentioned that on the show when I covered it. Yes, part of the seven.
Example. It comes straight out of Greece, right? And Greek is the only culture that went from, nothing up to something. Everybody else at that time period were living on top of the ruins of these ancient civilizations. But Greece was the only one that elevated itself out of that sort of worship of the past, and they started creating new things that people had never seen before. That's I think is really significant, and that was their style of education. And anytime they want a society to grow, they introduce those styles of education and the one-on-one mentorship that creates these people, these great people. But when they want societies to fall, they take that education and slash it down to nothing. And you look at the education system today.
Yes, it's happening again.
Yes, like to your point, Headless. Like, that's exactly what's happening. I think in religion too. Like, okay, I'm just gonna use this example.
Yo, what you identify with is people's religions nowadays. That's fucking scary.
Well, yeah, and then like people, you just get rule followers then, without being true believers. Like for example, when my youngest son just made his first communion not long ago, last year or whatever, none of the parents in that room, when we had to go to like parent meetings and stuff, they don't know why they're there. They're just doing it because, I have to please my parents. It's tradition. It's our culture. It's whatever. And like if you don't know or believe that your child is gonna receive like the body of Christ, like why are you here? Why are you wasting your time? If you don't believe, why are you here? So it's like it just becomes this like thing that we do just because, and we just follow rules just because. So it makes people dumber in that sense, right? And I think that's on purpose for sure.
I totally agree with that, Theresa. I mean, as you know, I also grew up Catholic, and I think obviously my dad does come from a very syncretic, to speak to the earlier point, culture, and he himself practices Kabbalah, which is like a syncretic Javanese religion. It's not quite anything. It's kind of a mixture of different things. So I think this is a really interesting idea that people are not taught at face value the inner or secret. If you're giving it like a three-layered, like a trivium, like a inner outer secret, like a tantric dialectic, you're not giving them the inner or secret layers as an initiate or as an acolyte or whatever. It's first level. So you're not giving it to those people. But that's the same with Dharma. I mean, you have to work there. You have to prove that you are there to be serious, to use the practices for the proper view, the proper reason. They don't just give you a mantra. They don't just say, okay, we're going to initiate you in these higher tantric texts and you can go practice the yogini tantras. Everybody loves when I post the scarlet, the red girl and the Vajra yogini. Everybody loves. I love that too. But you're not going to get that. You have to sort of prove yourself. You have to sort of say, like, I'm serious. I'm going to do this. I'm going to practice it seriously. And it takes a long time, and it's a lot of sacrifice, and it's a lot of hard work. And I think this is exactly part of what Catholicism has lost, is that, like, if you look at our grandparents, Theresa, I think they were a lot more knowledgeable on theology, a lot more knowledgeable on like dogma of the dogma of the church, and just general rules. And I think, to go back to Headless's point on theology, well, this interestingly came up the last time, is like, where did this idea of theology develop? Because there is this kind of division between philosophy of religion versus theology. Theology really is different than philosophy of religion, because philosophy of religion originally, like when we're talking like Zoroastrian times in Iran, or which was also a global religion, as was Manichaeism, from France all the way to China, and the Nestorian and Manichaean Christians had churches in China until the 1600s. So it is interesting to note. But it was really about the ritual performance. So the Zoroastrian priests were practitioners of philosophy of religion simply by doing the rituals. But people who were interested in theology, into this Aristotelian Greek idea, they we're interested in this idea of dialectics and dividing God into the 4 quadrants: time, space, dark, and light. So I think that's where, this is just my opinion, and this goes a little, it pushes a little against what Headless is saying, but I don't think it's necessarily opposed. I just think when you start doing that, and then you take that dialectical thinking and you apply it to ritual practices, then you create transgression. Because if you're saying that God is only good, so Zoroastrianism believes that God is only good, but then you say, oh, well, maybe God isn't only good. Maybe God is in this lower quality. Maybe God is in these multiple lower qualities. Maybe God is in multiple beings. Instead of saying, and then you practice that as a temple ritual. In some ways of thinking, you create like a tulpa or like a thought form or like, that is the transgression. The transgression is to take theology and to apply it then to philosophy of religion.
Well, sometimes, to make a point on that, if you have unacknowledged sort of evil that we could accept, maybe there is some kind of divine in the lower realms. If you've got unacknowledged forms of evil that you don't know how to deal with, then it becomes a much harder situation for the rest of society. And I think this is why we're seeing kind of the uptick in demons, is because they're all associated with that religion. Like, that's part of the Abrahamic religion that's just not really talked about, but it's increasing. We can see that in the rates of, schizophrenia and all the rest of these diseases that are just expanding by the day. I mean, look at dementia. That seems a lot like a demonic kind of a issuance. Well, we have all these unacknowledged demons that are crawling around all over us, and we can't really get past it because we don't acknowledge this stuff.
Yeah. Well, one thing too that was really helpful for me was actually listening to a lot of like exorcist talk. And I learned so much from just finding like their stuff on YouTube or whatever. And I was like, why is my faith not taught like this? And like to what you were saying before, you think like that, Catholicism, as an example, has been diluted a lot. And I think that's why you see a rise in people seeking out like the Latin Mass, for example, the pre-Vatican II ways. Like my parents went to school. They were taught the catechism in school. Like we don't know any of that stuff. Well, I started looking into it now myself, but
I just wanted to pop in real quick. So yeah. I listened to the, they're called the Blurry Creatures podcast. I don't know if you like them.
I like them a lot. Yeah.
Okay, so they had an episode where they were talking about like these elder gods, and this guy brought up the oath to Asclepius, which they call the Hippocratic Oath.
Okay.
Right, and he's like, doctors don't even take the Hippocratic Oath anymore, and it's like it's all part of this Nephilim system. And I'm like, wait a second. So the oath to Asclepius, one of the Nephilim, is both wanted and unwanted at the very same time. It's like, wait a second, guys. So you're calling these elemental forces that influence Christianity evil and good at the exact same time.
Oh, that's a little bit weird.
Yeah, right?
Because you didn't read the Hippocratic Oath and he's just going off of the script, because the very first thing in there is the oath to Asclepius, the healer god. So what I'm trying to say is in ancient Greece, they had exorcisms as well. And in fact, the entire biblical version of exorcism came from the Greeks, and they had their own medicine that was then reflected in the Bible, and people don't even know what they're looking at anymore. Like the baptism of John the Baptist, right, where he baptizes Christ, took place at an Asclepian, right? So this was the place where people would go for healing. That was like the ancient hospital. And so you've got this healer Jesus taking a bath at the Asclepian, which is part of the healing process. And you got to ask yourself, who are they trying to reflect here? There's a lot of crossover that really goes unacknowledged because these are demons, right? Well, they're actually the demons that have informed your own stories. So which is it?
Well, the demons were once upon a time angels as well.
100%.
Right? So... yeah, and like like the fallen angels, let's say. They were one time angelic
Right, but the fallen
Right.
angels would be the Greek gods. That's what they
That's
inverted
not
the entire symbolism.
just to push back a little, Headless. This is something I've heard a lot of neo-pagans say, is that the saints and angels or the demons or goetic spirits, they are just based on pagan gods. That's not true. You could go through the list. I'll go through them with you right now. That's not true. You can find there are saints that have been cut off the rolls of the Catholic Church. Totally fair. And maybe not based on historical personages, but in general, you can trace back all the angels and goetic spirits to the original Jewish angelologies, and they are not based on Greek gods. Simply because if you understand it in the way Theresa's saying it, which is the correct way, it's one system. It's a unified system. So there's a celestial and a chthonic. And the point of the Solomonic keys, okay, we'll say, so the greater and the lesser keys is to work together in a system. You're supposed to do both exercises at the same time. So then you gain control over the goetic spirits using the names of the angels, which you've already accomplished. That's the idea. It's supposed to be like a unification of the above and the below. It's not distinct. And
I agree.
I know you agree.
I just want to say that the entire symbolism of Christ in the Old Testament starts with Moses holding up the staff that has the snake wrapped around it, which is the symbol of Asclepius. So they're showing you the crucifixion of the serpent there, and then that later on takes place with Christ on the cross, and he's also baptized at an Asclepian. So I think those are a pretty strong association that they were just using this idea of this healer god, which had a tragic backstory, as this sort of setup for other stories to be built on top of it.
Set up for other stories. Yes, I like what you said there, Headless. Exactly. I think, upon reading the Bible more myself, I realized that it's almost like, okay, if you believe the Bible is true, let's just preface with that. But it's almost like God had to take us these little steps at a time. So if you have the serpent on the rod, that's number one, and then Christ comes later to supersede that. It's
That's
in
right.
baby steps. It's he can't just give it all at once. And he's bam, you saved. That's not how it goes. It's it has to be in these little baby steps. And then maybe Christ entering the river at the place where you said, sorry if I can't pronounce the name.
Oh, Asclepius.
Yes, there we go. It's almost yes, it is a healer god, but then also he's the ultimate healer. So he's superseding that. When I think of the Nephilim and the fallen angels, it's a move and a counter move, a move and a counter move, and it's God allows it, and he's cool. Now I'm gonna go in the river, bam, and then it's okay, you want to make giants, cool. I'm gonna wipe you out with a flood. Oh, you want to do this in Egypt, cool. I send 10 plagues. It's always these chess moves the whole time. We just talked about on Contemporary Problems earlier, the grid games. It's literally these grid games amongst the gods, and then ultimate father god is that's cool. Boom, I flick you.
Do you know how the Asclepian would do the healing process?
No, inform me.
Okay, so you would go into the Asclepian and you would sleep in the temple. This is why we got the term sleep in from.
Okay.
And you would have visions of Asclepian telling you how you can heal yourself. So it was a lot like Edgar Cayce. Right? And so this method was actually highly revered in the ancient systems, and it cured so many people. That's why they went to the Asclepian. What happened to the Asclepian?
I don't know.
It's gone. They don't use that method anymore. The closest we have today of that kind of thing is doing a sleep study. But a sleep study is kind of part of the process that they were going for here. So they had pretty advanced methods of curing diseases using psychic abilities as the backdrop of doing no harm, which is why the Hippocratic Oath was so important. That was their way of doing medicine. You look at our medical system today, and it's the complete inversion. They do as much harm as they want to.
True.
So if we had that information about how the gods taught humans to do things like medicine, we wouldn't be in the same situation we are today, and we'd be a lot healthier. I think that's something important to keep in mind, is all of this information is flattening. They're trying to flatten our heads. And that started a long time ago with the conversion to Christianity. That's why we had the Dark Ages. It's a flattening of consciousness, unfortunately. But, you got that glass ceiling and you're not allowed to go above it.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And I think like what Nick was saying and like what he's done with Lisa in the past of like studying the early Christian mystics and stuff, it's like, where did it like go wrong? Like why don't we still teach it that way? Or, invite that curiosity about the other elements and other areas of study. Like
Christian literalism becomes materialism.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yo, some of those people that we've covered, I'd be grateful if I understood half of what those people are fucking geniuses. And they're very enlightened, I think. They truly had experiences with God, I think.
Right, yes. Which is why they shifted the name of God in the New Testament to having the Yeshua, because this was a mystical interpretation of that Yahweh becoming something else. And Jin, you can back me up on this. That was like the alchemical way of Christian mysticism. And I know that's, a very powerful system.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I have like a million. I've got like a million trains of thought. I did want to bring up something because I see Lisa is in the chat, and her and I have discussed this in DM about this idea of the curandero, and I know she brought it up earlier in the comments. And so that's how I think of Jesus in my own way. I'm not a Christian, I'm the first to say it, but and I love Dharma. I will probably die. I will definitely die a Buddhist or a follower of Dharma, whatever you want to call it. But that's my choice, and I fully accept that has both positive and negative qualities, right? But anyways, I will say that I see like what Theresa's saying, like Jesus is coming through. He's a curandero of the curanderos. He is the Saint Cyprian of the, he's the Magi of the Magi's. He is I know we're saying that, or perhaps Headless is saying that Moses is a mythical or semi-mythical or pseudo-mythical character. Totally okay. I'm okay with that. I personally think that it's a real lineage. I personally see a sort of continuity there, and from the Old Testament into the New Testament, and the New Testament would never really have happened without the Judeo-Hellenic sort of that whole region of Turkey. It was so integral, that sort of Kabbalistic thinking, that even to the Greek magical papyri, like why they're so syncretic. Why you have the invocations to, yes, the Olympics, but then you have invocations to the angels, and you have invocations to Yehovah, and you have the 72 names of God in those magical papyri, because they understood that it is just part of a system. And like Nick said, it's because it's not exactly true. And this is something where I think Buddhism is really strong, is that we have the idea of subjective truth and then objective truth. Objective truth is not something you can really ever describe. It's like the name of God. It will make your ears bleed and your eyes like melt, like in Indiana Jones. That's the name of God. That's really what happens. But there are ways that humans can utilize them, manipulate certain things that we can say, like sounds that we can make. So that's kind of the idea. So I see Jesus as like emerging in a system. We can say that the Gnostics there were so many different kinds of Gnostics. There were so many different groups, and some of them probably were committing very, very transgressive actions. I'm not putting a negative quality on. I'm not even saying demonic. I'm just saying that compared to the morality of the other people living around, a lot of the Gnostic and a lot of the pagan behaviors would not have been acceptable. Because you have to think, like, Headless, this is the truth, in Himalayan sort of polytheism, if that's the word we're going to use, it's not usually the word I describe it, but yeah, I'll use that, is that a lot of them did practice blood sacrifice. A lot of them did practice human sacrifice. A lot of them do things that are very antinomian and transgressive in order to sort of this anti-cosmic idea of bringing about the end of the world. And that's also a very anti-cosmic sort of Satanist idea as well. And I'm not using Satanist in the mainstream idea. I'm using it more in the occult idea. So I think there's all these layers where I think the path is the path, and you either follow it to the end or you get lost amongst.
We have that too. They're called neocons.
Neocons?
Yeah, we have the same cult. They're called neocons, and they direct all of the Christian masses into these wars of aggression. They're like the dark priests.
Something I want to kind of bring up that Jim was going on. He mentioned it. I think it might have been kind of Lisa had met in chat, said something in chat, and he was kind of getting towards this. And something with the Bible too, because I guess I would assume if we're talking about Christian eschatology, that's going to be talking about the Bible regardless, to a sense. Now, when I was talking about before with the Catholic Church, when I think there was different times, like, Hildegard was a lot earlier. I think she was, ahead of her times. There was other people, but there was a time around the 14th, I'd probably say 1600s. There was a lot of advancements being made and stuff that I've covered on the show. And the interesting thing about this, and this is where I think could even be an issue if you're taking the whole book, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and putting it together, and you're expecting to understand that whole thing. This is where I think that could be an issue. But like where I'm going with this is that, believe it or not, when all those advancements were happening in the Catholic Church, do you know what they were using into their teachings to make these advancements? I'll give you guys a guess, any of you, if you want to take a guess.
It's right there. It's blood.
Kabbalah.
Every time. Oh, well, that too.
They literally were introducing Kabbalah, and they were even saying in the church themselves, you're not going to understand this whole book unless you use this as well, because even the Old Testament is based on it.
Yeah, 100%.
So like now, I think that right there in itself gives a problem to understanding that book. If people think they really do and don't pay any mind to Kabbalah.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
I hate to say that, but they really do work hand in hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the best. Sorry, Theresa, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think that's what, like, in my own experience, like studying other systems and beliefs, it made the picture more complete for me. Whereas, like, for me, I don't understand, like, oh, you have to do this on Sunday because this is like, I don't jive with that. Like, you just tell me to follow a rule, I'm like, no, I'm gonna do the opposite. Like, I need to understand the why.
Yeah.
And if I don't understand the why, then I have a problem following it. So that for me is the issue, is that that's not taught. And like what Headless is saying, then it just becomes control. Right.
It's a mystical book full of tools.
Yes.
Exactly.
Tools.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Who's using the tools? That's the question.
Yes.
So
Totally.
It's not a bad book. It's just full of tools. And those tools are very important to mankind. And I think it's being used by the wrong people. And it has been.
Sorry, Jen, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm doing a show on Pico della Mirandola with Greg Kaminsky.
Nice.
And he's sort of an expert on Pico. And I just think it's very interesting to look at it, because my kind of knowledge background is more in the medieval Kabbalah, not really Hermetic Kabbalah, but to then look at like this totally different system of Christian Kabbalah and how it was being applied, exactly like what Nick said, to these innovations. But it's not really different than medieval Kabbalah in many ways. It's very similar. It just places emphasis, and I think a lot of systems do this. I think it places emphasis on different things, but it doesn't necessarily discard or negate the things that are important in the other systems. It just has its own view, its own focus.
Well, let me ask you a question. Were there any conversos from the Jewish form of Kabbalah over to the Christian form of Kabbalah? Like people who had converted. Do you know of any?
Wait, could you say that again, Headless, too? I want to hear what you asked him.
Were there any converted from Jewish Kabbalah over to Christian Kabbalah? Because I think that was probably one of the main goals of creating Christian Kabbalah, is so that they could convert a lot of the Jewish intellectuals.
From what I understand of like the two texts that I've been looking at is that the conversos did not play a big role in that sort of that time that Nick is referring to, that early 1600s period. It was there now to answer your question, Headless, in like the full honesty, yes, there were conversos in about the 11th to 12th century. You see this with St. Augustine of Hippo. I forgot what his sect was. And he wasn't like he didn't practice Judaism. Like it was some kind of sect. It wasn't.
You talking about Pico again?
Saint Augustine.
Oh,
of
okay,
Hippo.
my bad. I thought you were still talking about Pico Del.
Oh no, I'm sorry, Nick. But I know that there were definitely conversos in the early history, and Lisa's reading one of my favorite books by Owen Davies right now, and she was telling me about it, and it's funny because he lays out this kind of history, this early grimoire publishing history in the 1600s, and how there were different groups involved in Europe, in different places in Europe, doing the publishing. So you had like a Jesuit, like underground indie publishers of publishing grimoires. Then you had like a Jewish kind of publisher, and then you had these like kind of hellfire, maybe satanic kind of people doing it. And then you had like these rebel monks that kind of were like getting their own funding, and then you had the French crown was funding some of it. So yeah, you have a lot of people coming together to sort of demystify, I guess, but also remystify the Bible in some ways of thinking.
Yeah, not to. I didn't want to steal your thunder. I guess I was stuck on Pico, but Pico, I think, was the first person to actually put on a cover the Kabbalah, like talking about the Kabbalah with Catholicism, which actually including it. Yeah, back in March, last March, the Occult Rejects actually covered him too. So yeah, very interesting guy. But you know, I think, and reason why I'm bringing him up again, because you were asking if you think that people were trying to get Jews to convert to like Catholicism. I do think that Pico was actually trying to get Christians to like not convert, but to be interested into Jewish stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So like I was thinking he kind of did the opposite in a sense. I think.
Reverse converso.
Yeah. But because he thought it actually helped understanding it. I don't think it was to like. In his opinion, it helped you understand the Bible better.
It shapes understanding. That's
Christianity in general is the fulfillment of Judaism. So why shouldn't you understand? Right?
Exactly.
Like you should want to understand like the Kabbalah and the Jewish traditions that came before, because that's the fulfillment of it. If that's what you believe.
And it's really deep shit too. Like if you
totally.
Like once you're in the tree, like I haven't been looking at the tree lately because it was like I was getting a little too into it. But when you're in it, it's very heavy, and you can start to see it. You can start to see the things in real life, like how things work, how things interact, not just astrologically, but colors, the way trees grow. I mean, it's deep shit. It really is.
Yeah. All right.
Sorry, I didn't.
No, that's fine.
I had a comment about that too, because I think the whole phrase the children of God or God's chosen people has really been used as a massive takeover. And I don't think anybody understands the significance of those words, but they're saying that everybody else is below them and they are God's chosen people. And we've just been going along with it this whole time because it says so in the book. And what ends up happening because of it is all of the defenses and all the rationality goes down, and really bad things start taking over because our education system has been under attack for over 100 years.
You know what, Headless? I think that whole, like, unfortunately, and let's say maybe somehow it wasn't meant to be like that and it got mistaken or misworded or whatever, but that whole thinking, in my opinion, really trickles down. Even if people aren't religious, I'm sure somehow that ideology trickles down into, like, politics. What conspiracies you even believe in?
Yeah, right?
Yo, it's just like me believing this means I'm automatically better than you.
If you hear your whole life that if you curse Israel, you will be cursed, and if you bless Israel, you will be blessed on a daily basis. That's going to
Okay.
change your thinking.
Okay, so Headless, this is a thing I didn't know about that attitude in Christianity till like a few years ago. I'm just saying, I had never even heard of the rapture till 2020.
I
And
grew
I'm
up in those churches.
What? Yeah, like I can totally understand. And like, okay, not to like sell Catholicism on people. That's not what I'm doing. But like, we don't, and that's not in my experience whatsoever. Like, I honestly have to say, I think it's way more mystical than like Protestant Christianity. That's very like Bible thumping and like these are the rules. And like, if you like, I'm just like, whoa, like this is a whole other thing I never even knew about. Yeah, it's like the drilling the rapture into people, the support for Israel. I'm like, huh? Like
It's like a dial.
Even as messed up as Pope Francis is, when Israel Hamas started, he was like just praying for world peace. He didn't even support like either side. He was just like, okay, let's keep it neutral, people, keep it moving. Like that to me, yes, that's a whole political play and definitely used on the American people. I want to say it's more American than in Canada, I think.
I would agree with you there. But
Yeah.
that's the thing, though. Maybe it always has been, you know? Because it's like a dial.
Maybe.
You turn up the literalism, and then everybody's thinking starts to go into this sort of materialistic prophecy mode. And they start thinking about how we can start fulfilling the prophecy. And anytime they want to, they can just dial it up or dial it back. And you see the same patterns emerging throughout Europe. You know, you've got these witch trials and everything else. The world's coming to an end. We got to get rid of these witches and all the rest of this other stuff that comes along with that kind of eschatological thinking. And it's not a pretty picture.
Well, on the point about the witch burnings, there's something really interesting to note about that. The early witch trials were run by the Dominicans, who were actually rooting out real of human sacrifice, of animal sacrifice, of transgressive rituals. So that was like a real thing. It wasn't just like these, you know, it got re-narrativized by like these 20th century feminists later on. And I'm not like, I don't have a problem with women. I just want to say that. You know, it's not me. I'm not slagging all women. I'm just saying that feminism probably wasn't the right frame, or feminist Marxism, to look at the witch trials. So part of the witch trials was definitely real. And then in the later witch trials, they became run by the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were interestingly really interested in who was publishing the books, as I mentioned, because they were also running several underground publishers. So a lot, if you look, and there's Owen, I'm not trying to shout him out because I find him to be very libtard, but Owen Davies also wrote a book.
I was thinking about asking him to come on, so maybe I should hold off on that.
I'm sorry, Nick. I apologize.
No, thank you. You know, no, I mean, listen. I mean, as long as if he sticks to the topic, I could care less. You know. But
you know, he wrote. It's a great book. So he breaks down the numbers per country, and he breaks down like who exactly it was, instead of just like having it out in the mythos in the Margaret Mead book from the early 1900s or whatever. She wrote the witches, I forgot what it is, Drawing Down the Moon or whatever. And yeah, so that's all fictional. Like that's all fictionalized, and he breaks it down. And you know, you can look at certain Northern European countries, it was more men were prosecuted for witchcraft than women, and the reason was different than what people might think. Is because men were more literate and they owned the grimoires. So that's basically it. So they were really persecuting like magi. And so I just think that there's something really hidden, like there's a lost kind of history, and we plaster, just like with Christianity, like we plaster over the things with these other ideologies and these other, you know, sort of layers and ways of thinking, and we don't really cut through it.
When haven't magicians been in secret wars with each other?
Oh, well, that's the history of the world.
That shit goes on now.
That's what
I know for a fact. It's fun. You know something I wanted to add. I wanted to add to that, Jim. And I can't. I'm not trying to like. You just keep handing them to me. Probably back in like March, April, or May. I did the thing that you were talking about with the witches. I don't even remember the name of it, but there is a grimoire that you were talking about. Yes, a Dominican, whatever. Dude, wrote like this grimoire that like determined what witches were and how to deal with them. And for some reason, somehow, that just got accepted.
Malleus Maleficolorum. The witch's hammer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was just like, yo, like, and the guy was kind of like butthurt against women anyway, they basically said, but like, I don't know, like, it just seemed a little silly to me, and it's just like, how did this get accepted? And it's like, or was this just like, oh, this is the best excuse we can come up with?
I really think it was about Gnostics. I think that that's really where neo-Gnostics or like, you know, medieval European Gnostics. I don't think it was about village witches. I
agree, but there's a problem with the Albigensian Crusade. They can't find anybody who actually had any of these documents prior to being accused of it by the Catholic Church. And they were all admitting to it under torture because the last group of people that the Catholics wiped out was the Gnostics. And so they had to go fall back on some form of theology to justify the Albigensian Crusade and the crushing of these people. So they called them Gnostics. But I don't think they really were. That was a very ancient religion by the time the Catholic Church brought it to the southern part of France.
Well, just to push back on that, there is the St. Roche, Mary Magdalene, and Black Madonna churches that still exist all over southern France and Occitanian-speaking Spain. So I think
that was after the Albigensian.
Yes, but we're talking about the 1100s, right? So we have to like go to the material history. We're not talking about like the ancient Gnostics. We're talking about like these kind of Cathar things, and we know that there were Cathar castles. We know there was like a Cathar history, and we know that they were very anti-world, like they were very anti-cosmic, as they would have called themselves. They were about performing the transgression in the real world to undermine what I always call daddy God issues. Like they were just like, we don't like daddy God, so we're going to, you know, do the bad thing, and then he's going to come in and destroy the world, and then we'll be free of this demiurge, Archon,
you see
whatever.
It today, what they're doing with AI and all the rest of this transhumanism. It's a reflection of that very system. It's like ultimate transgressiveness.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, AI is definitely part of it. It's part of their system of. Yeah, it's a demiurge. That's the demiurge, is the AI. Like that you want to talk about what the demiurge really is. It's like a agglomeration of hosts, just not maybe heavenly hosts, maybe a different kind.
That's why you need the drama.
Do you ever think that some of those, not to go back to it, even though it kind of was a little bit off the topic, well, and I guess not, but even like the witch trials, you ever think some of those, I mean, I think especially in Salem at one point, even talking to Ron, because he did have family that was actually involved in that shit, he said at one point he thinks it was just about properties too. But like, I do think like at one point, like you could have used that to, I mean, listen, if COVID would have gotten a little bit crazier, the vaccination gotten a little crazier, it would have been the same thing as the witch trials with certain types of people, possibly.
Totally.
It's the lesson.
It was in a way just
Once you
to
open
target
that
somebody.
box.
It was just write this up and say that's them so we can fucking round them up like Nazis.
Right. It's like Pandora. Once you open the box, you can't put it back inside. And back then, that was the deal. You had this idea of folie à trois, where entire cultures would basically lose their mind for a long period of time until coming to their senses after all the fires had been put out. But that's like part of the fanaticism of Bacchus. Bacchus is the fanatic god. And when you shove that into your system, you're going to create fanatics.
Yeah, you know, Ron even told me, he said in his family, he said you will see both different sides of the Salem witch trials, of people fucking making the accusations and the people getting fucked marrying. Why are they marrying?
Right.
There's something deeper to that story than what was really going on out there.
I think this is really interesting, Nick, and I'll just add this, is that who popularized the witch trials in contemporary culture? Arthur Miller, who was a communist. And so you can see them using these kinds of
Hitleresque.
sort of like, yeah, it is. You know, and they're doing these. It's like a struggle session, right? Like that's really what like the Scarlet Letter. That's really what it's about. It's about a struggle session. It's like very Maoist, and so they would have struggle sessions in this sola scriptura Puritan court where any deviation from the norm was going to be transgressive. But then it was really about accusing your neighbor to get their land. So it wasn't even it didn't have any material basis. So it was just all hysterical.
Think about the iconoclasm of the 500s. The iconoclasm of the 500s is a perfect example. They started attacking statues, and they wanted to take down all of these temples, and they started burning all these villages that had anything to do with these gods. It was the same kind of struggle session. It's been the same kind of struggle session since the beginning. Proto-communism.
Sounds like what we see in the George Floyd riots, the DNC riots, the Hamas, like pro-Palestine, like that's all the same stuff, guys. Nothing new under the sun.
But see, we've got our heads are full of conservative and liberal. And we think that that's the real dichotomy. It's never been the real dichotomy. They just use these different sides and they interpolate. Again, it's like the fourfold God versus the threefold God. If you've got the eyes on the triangle, instead of seeing it as a fourfold system, you're not going to understand the cyclical nature of it. These things are very closely interrelated, and they oftentimes marry each other. And this is part of what keeps them in control, is the ability to have that type of mind control within society.
100%. I actually had a quote that I prepared like way before when Nick told me what our topic was. It's kind of off topic, but I'm just going to read it because I brought it up. And so it's from the Jason Liu's book. I forgot the whole title, but it's about the John Dee and the Aethers, so the Enochian Aethers. And so he posits that time is conceived of as an Ouroboros. He's referring to the Old Testament, specifically Revelations. Beginning with the fall from Eden, represented by 333, Coronazone, with the quality of human consciousness descending into darkness on a downward arc, at the nadir of which God descends into creation as Christ to redeem fallen humanity. Time is then terminated by the final war with the spiritual darkness, incarnated as the beast, which is represented by 666, Babylon, and the Antichrist. So he's positing there's a trinity, like an inverse trinity, prior to mankind's salvation and return to the Edenic stage. So basically why I pulled this up is because it's interesting when you think about it. He's saying that there's no linear time in the Bible, that you can look at different, especially for Revelations, but in reference to the whole Bible, that it's a perennial story. I think that's what his thesis is that it's a story that is about the redemption of mankind, rather than I'm not saying it's not supernatural. Okay, I'm pro supernatural, but I think he's saying it's more of a story of mankind and more of a story of how we are in control of this realm. And Buddhism also, I just want to say that Buddhism also posits that we are the controllers of our own realm. Like, we control this desire realm. This is ours. God gave it to us, or however you want to describe that. And like these even pagan gods, Headless, it's like all of them, they do not belong here. They are not in charge of us. We are in charge of us. We have our own free will, and we have to exercise that. And so I think that is an interesting way to look at Revelations, because I think that people, and not just Christians and not just Protestants and not, not even just people who aren't into conspiracy or deep politics or deep theology like we're doing, I think they forget that we do have free will and we do have choice, and we can liberate ourselves if we really want to.
Well, I think a lot of pagan cultures, especially back then, believed that they were not only the marble, but they were the sculptors. And they understood that their destinies were in their hands, and that it wasn't always up to the gods. And they might have designs of their own, but there was always that separation. It wasn't nearly as, you have to pray for everything, or you have to, whatever. It's go out and get it, be your own person, make your own destiny. And I think that's been lost to a large extent.
Yes. I agree with that. I mean, I even think that's why sometimes, you want to take the story for as it is. I mean, didn't even Jesus disappear and kind of go off and do his own thing for a while? You will see that a lot in even stories of, religious or spiritual people. They tend to disappear, or they go off on their own and find themselves and come back and kind of share their journey, their experience and their journey with others to help them get on their own as well. I mean, really.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of it is about listen, I had this experience. This is how you can liberate yourself. And just somehow that gets fucked up. It turns into, I need to idolize and fucking give you money for this and that.
Yeah.
It's the first opportunity they get that you got to monetize, you know? And monetizing stories, that's been the real game this whole time.
Monetizing stories. I love that. It's
okay,
true.
think about the symbol for the sun. I was going to talk about this in our next episode, but the symbol for the sun could be people sitting around a campfire. Like, this is where we get our energy from these stories that we tell ourselves, and that's what we see in the rest of the world. You know, it's all about the story. How do you get outside of the narrative structure? It applies to every sentence you can say. Like, everything is broken down into very specific parts. This is why Carl Jung was so into the idea of the hero of 1,000 faces and all the rest of these archetypes. It's because these are how we see ourselves at a minute by minute basis. And that is very important to our identities, you know?
I think that it's really funny because someone did a meme about how God remains anonymous by performing these like small miracles in your life, but you can't necessarily recognize God or the miracle. And someone was saying, well, this is just proof of Buddhism, because it's like the divine chooses to acknowledge that non-self is real. So this idea of identity, ideology, I think I personally am on that thinking where that's kind of all bullshit. Yeah, it's real to an extent, but like so much of that layer we can discard and sort of, I don't even know, like, just we can do something with it. We can do something more with what is left than like those things that we place upon ourselves multiple times over, create these like crazy identities, whatever. But I think that's all bullshit. I think just, discard it and see what's left.
Well, I think this goes back to the educational part, because normally people are able to hold two competing ideas in their head at the same time. And unfortunately, what you find is that the less intellectual people are able to be with how they view the world, the more materialistic and identity obsessed they become. You have to have a type of nobility of thought so that you can get outside of this self-obsessed world that they find themselves in. And unfortunately, once the education system declines to that level, ego becomes the only God, and that ego is what's going to be driving all these decisions, instead of having something higher that you look up to.
Yeah, and I think that's where a big push towards all the identity stuff comes in, right? To fill people's void with all these labels on yourself, instead of identifying yourself as a child of God, first of all. Right? Yeah. It's crazy.
Couldn't agree more. Because, where's the spiritualism in any of that? That's the one thing, like, everybody tries to compare these, the trans movement with like ancient Hermes and stuff like that. But it's like, where's the spirituality in what they're doing, people? Like, normally this unification of male and female takes place in a higher realm within our consciousness. And it has to, if you're going to see the world in a more complete way. They don't have that anymore. So they become highly gender confused because they've got competing thoughts that they can't really rectify. So it's that mental glass ceiling that creates these sort of repeating cycles of self-obsession.
Yeah.
I do personally. Oh, sorry, Theresa, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I do think that the trans stuff does have a very deep metaphysical component. I know a lot of people are very interested in this Kybalian cult and how a lot of her priests were eunuchs. I know that I've been personally doing some work on my show about the Kubjika Tantra and how some of her priests, and she's very similar in some ways to a Lilith figure. She's crook-backed. She has 11 heads. She sits under the earth. And anyways, it's very similar in some ways. And some of her priests, not the ones from the 11th century, but maybe much earlier, they were also eunuchs. So I do think that there is some kind of, I don't know, occult layer to that. But I also agree that it's everything that both of you are saying. It's like the void of identity. It's like filling it with this bullshit layer of like sexual debauchery, whatever, degeneracy. And then also like, who am I? Oh, you can change yourself. You want to be better, but you could just change it through Lupron, change it through surgery. But those are just fake, because we all know that doesn't even work. That's not really, people aren't really transitioning gender. It's just an idea.
Yep. It's symbolic. And I think that hits both topics right there. It's a symbolic change. So that's why you would have these eunuchs make eunuchs out of themselves, because they needed to make a symbolic change. What's interesting is the demographics. So in the ancient world, where these Kybalian priests would cut their junk off, it was only the slaves that would participate. So the slaves wanted to elevate their position in life, so they would cut their own genitalia off so they could become these priests, because it was against the law for any Roman citizen to castrate themselves. They needed babies. They needed lots of soldiers. So the public censor would go around, and actually, if you didn't have a wife, he would force you into a marriage, because they needed children, lots of them. That's one of the defining factors of fascism versus communism, is they need lots of people, and they force that on you, right? So this fascist state made these slaves that wanted to elevate their position cut their genitalia off. Now just apply that to our government and look at where all of the trans movement is headed.
You know, I was going to say, but you ended up getting there. I was going to say just the last 4 years, or around the same time we had COVID, school got fucked off in many ways. They started pushing people to just, basically offer to get their shit chopped off.
Yep.
And now I'm not saying that these people are Catholics and Christians, but like they even are now, the left is pointing at how, because of J.D. Vance and Catholicism or Christianity, like they're almost like even saying how like that stuff is horrible now because it's so conservative.
Have I talked about...
So like you see all of these things being brought up now in the last 4 years.
Have I talked about Justinian and Theodora yet?
No.
Okay, so this is the 550s. This guy Justinian I, he's the emperor of Constantinople, Eastern Roman Empire, right? He is in a war against the Goths, and this guy Procopius writes the history of it, right? So in Procopius's history, he has this one book called the Court of Justinian and Theodora. He was writing about the battles, but this court book, which started conspiracy culture, by the way, when it leaked out of the Vatican in the 1300s. Like until that time, they didn't really have any writings about the inner workings of the courts of these different figures. But after Justinian and Theodora's court was published and people saw exactly what was going on inside that Christian empire, they wanted to hear more. So they came out with more and more secret histories after that. And that spurred on conspiracy culture to begin with back in the 1200s. So this book talks about how Justinian was demon possessed, and his whore wife Theodora, who's still a saint in the Eastern Roman Empire, right? She actually was a famous poisoner. She liked to poison a lot of people. So she also loved to torture men. So she's a feminist icon today because she would take good men down into the basements of these churches that she built, and she would castrate them and do all sorts of stuff to them. She had an army of followers that were nothing but eunuchs and whores, right? So the eunuchs and whores, they would act as her intelligence network. So she would use that intelligence network against this other group called the Greens, right? So they were divided by these chariot teams,
is
right?
This House of the Dragon, or like Daenerys Targaryen? No, I'm just saying it's so similar. I'm saying
now.
It's so similar.
What they had was these two groups of chariot teams, because chariot racing was the biggest sport in the world back then, right? So you had charioteers that were making equivalently more than modern athletes back then, right? So we're talking like people making billions of dollars as a charioteer, amazing amounts of money, biggest sport in the world. They had these two prominent teams, the Blues and the Greens. The Greens were conservative men who wanted the empire to get back on track and not be, bogged down by all this liberal thinking that came from Theodora, because Theodora controlled the Blues. So Justinian would play the Greens off against the Blues and the Blues off against the Greens, and they would use that friction between the two to maintain a stranglehold on power. Does that sound familiar? And so they use this whole army of eunuchs and whores to identify any men of virtue in the community. So they would take them down to these basements and force confessions out of them by beating them savagely. And so she's a feminist icon today, and she later became the empress, the first empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. That's why they call her a saint, because she ended her reign by going on a massive iconoclasm campaign of smashing all of the ancient wonders from Greece. She loved that.
Whoa.
So this is Theodora. This is the Christian legacy in Turkey.
Damn, she sounds like Daenerys Targaryen to me.
It's wild stuff. Right. At one point, Justinian's head comes off of his body and floats around the castle. And it's like, what the hell is this? I was just reading about military history, and now you're talking about some guy's head that comes off of his body and floats around, and people have to shake him awake. It was really strange. But this was written by a contemporary historian about these events.
That's crazy.
Demon possession. They just take it wherever they go.
Take it anywhere they can.
That's right, because Christian, exorcisms are slightly different than a lot of the exorcisms that came before that, right? If you look at King Solomon, he would put all of the demons into bottles. He would get rid of them and dispose of them properly. What Christians do in their exorcisms is they just shoo them out of the body and into the rest of the world again, so they're not actually taking care of the problem, right? That's a big part of all the rest of these religions is they take the demons and they seal them away and they put them someplace where they can change into something better. Christianity doesn't. They just shoo them out. Go possess the next person. We need more business.
Well, I will say that in terms of exorcism, from what I understand, obviously I've never performed one, but from what I understand, it is easier to expel a spirit than it is to capture it, because it takes like a much more sophisticated sort of religious or magical entrapment. You have to have a device or some kind of vessel for it, right? Like a replacement vessel. So it is actually easier, though it is supposedly harder on the person possessed to have the spirit expelled. And that's what Buddhism tries to do. Obviously, that you can expel a spirit because it's a last resort tool. It's just not your first tool in the box. Right. But it tries to integrate the demon into, like, subjugate it with the theurgic practices. That's sort of the idea, is that you do the practices and you subjugate it yourself, because that demon really is ultimately empty. It's just yourself that you're looking at, and something about you. Now, you may not have access to that sort of consciousness or that evil force, but there's something in it that is a reflection in you. So you try and you tame it, I guess.
That element is, I think, one of the reasons why these demons can get so powerful, and why they're getting more powerful today, is that they get expelled, they come back, they're learning every time, and they're changing every time, and it's not going away, because normally you got to put it back into the cycle of nature so that it can be expelled peacefully without hurting anybody else. And that's actually a big theme in 18th century exorcisms. They would always do that, but now this sort of Catholic model kind of took over, because the dominant religion in the United States until the 1850s was folk magic. And it's undeniable. That was the thing. They all had their folk magic. It acted as medicine. It added all sorts of different flavor to all of these events. You see in Washington, D.C., how much they admired the Greeks. Like, there was a lot of freedom of thought going on back then that we just lost once we had, total domination of this other form of Christianity, which really happened in the 1850s onward.
Well, I think it's interesting that you raise this idea of folk magic, because in my experience, folk magic is kind of the degradation rather than
It was of the
it's
polytheism.
the degradation of something else. It's like it's a lower, not, I don't want to say lower form, but it's not, it's an incomplete form of something higher. And a lot of those times, and this is just my experience, and I don't know, and Nick, you can totally chime in and disagree, but I sometimes think that people doing magic, like magic, that is a trap in and of itself. Like, yes, I think there's a time and place where you can do a little something here and there, but I think like people now seem to have very magical thinking, even about astrology, even about, it's a very like, oh, I'm gonna get what I want, I'm gonna do this spell, I'm gonna do this. And folk magic's very like that. It's well, we would say in Buddhism, it's reinforcing the desires. So it's like about getting what you want right now, rather than what is the best thing for me in the more medium to long term.
I would say there's a lot of folk magic wrapped up in herbalism, and herbalism was passed mother to daughter in America. And all the little tricks and secrets and rules of thumb that went along with putting a spell on, an herb was passed on in that way as well. So they had a lot of medicine that was related to that folk magic. And that's why it was the dominant religion, because that's how you dealt with these sicknesses. And they actually had really good records of healing people. So that healing practice really did carry on in other forms of charismatic Christianity and other forms like spiritualism and things like that. That was that folk magic bend that kind of, got funneled out, I guess.
Totally, and I agree with that. But I will say that in the 1800s, American herbalism was actually codified into two schools, the Eclectics and the Thompsonians. So there were institutionalization of the healing practices and like the different modalities. And obviously were other schools that I'm not remembering right now. But in terms of the mother to daughter thing, that might be a regional, like that might have regional specificity, but in terms of the broader practice of like naturopathy comes right from the 1850s. I mean, that we still have today, like in Theresa's in Toronto. I'm from Toronto. We have the Canadian Naturopathic College right there in North York. It is one of the oldest, like it used to be an eclectic university. That's what they used to call it. And so, there are, I think there was multiple systems, and I think, it's hard to say, like there was an oral tradition. Yeah, sure, that could be true. But I also know, like Nick brought up hoodoo before. So in hoodoo, a lot of the times you read the Psalms. So it's like a Jewish Kabbalistic practice over the herbs before you apply them to a candle or before you apply them to a person. So I think that there was and even what's that Dutch magic, the powwow magic from the Pennsylvania, that is really just Kabbalah. Like if you read like the Long Lost Friend, that is really just Kabbalah, but it's kind of been Calvinized.
Right. And there was a lot of polytheism preserved in folk magic, which is very interesting, because that polytheism in the folk magic, it didn't just go away. Like a lot of people maintain their connection with these gods, even though they were Christian. That's important to keep in mind, because those were more successful peoples than a lot of their neighbors that completely lost all, reference to self, because again, this goes back to the layers. So this layer cake of history, as you're adding more and more layers, you're losing sort of that view of the past, and you still have that kind of ancestral memory within you, but now it's buried by all these other conflicting stories. And those conflicting stories can create situations that, maybe you're not prepared for. But if you had a better history view as to what ancestral memories make you up, then you kind of have a different view on all the rest of the things going on right now, because those things are being influential, whether we want to realize it or not. I mean, you could look at the rat studies about ancestral memory where, a sperm donor will end up influencing the memories of his kids without ever having any contact with them. And it's like, well, how much more on the human level are we like that? And how much does the way we think influence those ancestral memories?
I don't have any ancestral memories. I'm just gonna be honest. I go with what I'm a wisdom scientist at the end of the day. Like, I'm not trying to big up myself, but I go with what works. It, like, Buddhism, like doing the tantric stuff has worked for me. It worked for me in a way that Western Hermeticism did not work. Not to say that I didn't try. I tried, but Buddhism took me there. So, but I didn't go for that because of some like long lost kinship with like my lost tradition. I went there because I had experience with it as a kid, but then I also was like, I want to go see what is there and I want to see if it works. I want to test it.
Can I give you a good example though? So you've got the Scythians, which ride across the European plains that have these covered wagons, and they have these herds of cattle, and they're the first one with the horse, right? And then you look at America, and they've got this ideal of a cowboy, which is the exact same thing as like this Scythian character, only it's, modernized for this American West. And you look at the demographics of America, and they're mostly Germanic people. So drawing upon this archetype of the cowboy Scythian, you can actually get people to think in a certain way by using those deeply held references that maybe a lot of people don't have today on the tips of their tongues, but it exists somewhere within them. That's why they identify with this cowboy character. That's kind of this ideal that comes through this cultural memory.
Well, in Canada, we have Tijon, who is the lumberjack guy from Quebec, and Theresa knows what I'm talking about. And he wears the flannel shirt, and he's like a lumberjack. So my mom's French Canadian, so yeah.
Is he a giant?
Pardon?
Is he a giant?
Sometimes, but not always. Sometimes
the giants?
He can be a dwarf. Sometimes he can be a dwarf. So I will just say that. But it depends on the region. But I'm just saying that, like, yeah, I totally see what you're saying. Like, there are cultural touchstones or like archetypes that they use. I just, like, I'm half French Canadian. I don't really identify with that flannel shirt wearing lumberjack. Like, I like flannel too, but like not as a lumberjack. Like, I don't tap maple is what I'm saying. Like,
I think it's like ancestral memory is this thing that we're not even aware of a lot of the time. And like, I've done like a past life regression in once upon a time I did that. And I mean, I don't know. I'm still like neutral on the idea of past lives as a conclusion that actually exists or not. I think a lot of the time it is ancestral memory. Is what you're thinking is your own memory, but it's not necessarily. It's the quantum memory, or it still exists in your cells from your ancestors. So I can tell you, though, from having done the past life regression experience, a lot of the things that I would recall, then looking back on it, I was like, oh, that's why I'm very interested in Roman mythology or Greek mythology, or why I had a strange overwhelming feeling when I went to visit Venice, or why I identify with certain cultures or certain periods of history you're drawn to.
This is the Greek idea of reincarnation. It's not some airy-fairy thing. It's in the blood.
Yes.
It's in the blood. Well, a lot of other, New Agers have turned it into something about being Cleopatra every time you close your eyes.
Right? Or why when you remember a past life, are you always royalty or some shit? Why does nobody remember being like a garbage collector in the plague? Well, nobody remembers that shit.
No, I totally, I guess that I'm definitely, like, I like my Asian stuff. I totally get it. Like, I see that's a layer.
You identify with it more, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, 100%. And that's totally true. I usually attribute it to just growing up, like how I grew up. But yeah, I mean, totally, I could see that. Yeah. I also think, like, reincarnation, like what Headless is saying, I think that's a great point in what Theresa said. Like, everybody thinks they're Cleopatra, but you could be born in any of the 6 realms. That's the idea. Like, you can be born in the Asura realm, you can be born in the God realm, you can be born in the animal realm, you can be any of them, and you can come back as a human, and that's your desired rebirth, is to come back as a human, because we can climb up the tree, as I often say. None of the other races can, or none of the other realms, they don't have that possibility. We're the only ones. So I think that is a really interesting point, is that, I think reincarnation is very misunderstood, and we don't necessarily consider it in the blood. It's more that it is just a function of the cosmos, like a karmic function, and it's a lot more dependent on our personal accumulation, but the people that we are born into, like the families we are born into, that is also part of our karma. So I think that there is an interrelationship between what Theresa and Headless is saying and what I'm saying too.
Yeah.
Can I do a little Hellenic rant right now about the painting behind me?
Sure.
All right, so this painting was by a guy named Gustav Klimt. It's called Medicine, right? And right here in the foreground, we have Hygeia, daughter of Asclepius. And Hygeia, right here with the snake, is holding the cup of Lethe. And the cup of Lethe makes you forget all of your memories from the past life as you return to the river of souls. Right? So the river of souls up here, this is all the mortals. These are all the people who are alive or on this plane of existence. And if you notice real quick, they're all asleep. So the real consciousness is not while you're alive, it's while you're beyond the realm, right? And over here, you've got the image of life sort of pumping out the babies into this river of souls. And so this idea here is you see the blood coming down. That's sort of like how the memories are transferred. They're all sort of clinging to that blood. So this is like the reincarnation picture, right? And he got a lot of flack from doctors for this because Hygeia is associated with medicine. And what he's saying is no matter what the medicine they give you, you will always die. That's sort of what their interpretation of it was. But it's funny that they would say that because how badly has medicine failed since this time that they would even have a reason to be upset at that anymore? They've proven it, there's nothing more to say about that. So this story of the river of Lethe also got manifested in this work by Parmenides called On Nature, right? And in On Nature, he comes out with this word, aletheia. So this would be forgetting, and aletheia means the revealed truth. And so I think we've completely butchered the idea of occultism. We shouldn't be talking about occultism. We should be talking about aletheia, remembering, seeing the revealed truth. Instead of thinking about this whole thing like a closed eye, maybe we should be thinking with our open eye. Because we've got the memories of seeing it all. Why can't we kind of try to access that? Why can't we try to ascend to that level? There's a really deep message within that. And I think it wasn't until looking at this that I realized that there could be a lot more that we're just not getting on a very basic level. That would be like our birthright senses, right? And without the ideas of reincarnation that are laid out so perfectly in these images, you're missing a huge part of your soul, right? You're missing a huge part of those birthright senses that now we don't have access to. And number one way of getting rid of reincarnation was instituting Christianity in Europe.
Well, early Christians did believe in reincarnation, so let's just acknowledge that. But then also, I will say, in like the OG reincarnation religion, which is Dharma, we do have a grandmother figure who feeds people soup to forget your past life. That's a folktale, Chinese folktale. It's called Mung Po Po if people want to look her up. And there's also a Tibetan analog, but we do not identify with our past lives because that's not helpful for us in this life. That's kind of the thinking. We need to deal with our karma in this life by creating better karma. And then that's also what Theresa said, people always remember their Cleopatra, but how is that helpful to someone if they're stuck in this life? And they're just remembering and they're saying, oh, I'm Cleopatra, like in the past life. That's great. You can be Cleopatra. Maybe you're like one part of her little component, but that's not going to help you. It's like if you're a god in the past life, like a lot of people are fallen gods, you must have fucked up. So, time to move forward.
Right. I think in a European context, though, I think this is really kind of important because if you're told in this religion that, all of these people are condemned because they're not God's chosen people. And it's only through this redemption that you can actually ascend to the level of being one of God's chosen people again. Only if you accept this other group of people as being the justified heir or whatever they claim of this God, it really kind of puts that blood connection to all of the rest of your ancestors below this God's chosen race of people, right? So it's like you have to look at yourself as being lesser to be in that religion. And unfortunately, having that perspective has really messed up a lot of things. Like, we don't really have any kind of unifying cultural connection anymore, because we don't see each other as being special or being different. Or, you know, a lot of the cultures around the world are pro their ethnicity. White people can't be pro their ethnicity. We get immediately shit upon for that. That's crazy, but it's been evolving over a long period of time. You know, that's not something that just happened yesterday. There's always a push to sort of keep down Edom, because they call us, the Roman people, you know, the Christians, they call us sons of Esau. And they think that Esau is this, you know, great Satan in Judaism, because he opposes Jacob's right to rule everything, because he rightfully stole his birthright from Esau, the previous culture, right? And so as sons of Esau, we're not seen as equal to them, because they rightfully got the birthright from God, right? So unfortunately, we have this pattern repeating over and over again, because in the Old Testament that everybody has to read to be a Christian, you've got these concepts of racial supremacy. But it's not you that's the racial supremacist. And what's also interesting is the Philistines were Greeks, right? So the Philistines with the big giant guy, they were Greeks, and they were big people, right? And Jewish people are generally smaller in stature. So you've got these myths like Goliath, this massive Greek character, but they don't tell you he's Greek. You know, Amalek, also another kind of European tribe. Well, you've got to destroy Amalek every time you get a chance. Like, anytime, Amalek is not to be remembered only in times of war. So unfortunately, we're Amalek, you know, and that's important to point out, because these two eschatologies are matched up in going for a Gog Magog war. That's what they're pushing for. That's why they want to go to war with Iran, is because in the prophecies, that's Magog, and Gog and Magog have to fight. So taken in that perspective, you can kind of understand that this cycle is coming to an end really quickly, because they want to kick it off. They're tired of sitting around waiting.
Yeah.
Well,
3,000 years.
I think that push to, like, you know, be so pro God's chosen people, that's definitely like a political ploy for sure. And I think that's why, you know, it's interesting though that like Protestant American Christians embrace that so fully, because it's like, how can you, okay, not to sound wackos, guys, but like, how can you fully embrace and then like elevate these people above yourself who crucified your savior? I don't know. I'm just saying, it's a crazy thought. Not that current Jews did that. Obviously, they're not responsible for their actions of their ancestors. Obviously, but like, when you think about it, what is the reasoning to protect so fully?
We know what it is. They want the end times to happen. They're both very, very much in anticipation of happening with the end times. And that's a very dangerous perspective to have.
Very dangerous. Absolutely. Okay.
And not enough people realize that. This is a religious conflict that is going on in front of our eyes, and we have to be able to say, stop this bullshit. Yeah. All right? We don't want this to happen.
Well, and
if
also,
you do want it to happen, you can't really be a Christian.
Exactly. That's what I was just about to say, Alice. If you're truly a Christian, you should believe that's why Christ had to come, to abolish all the old ways, to fulfill all those covenants, right? And then to make that bridge for the Gentiles, then the Philistines, and the Amaleks of the world, the us's of the world. Okay, none of the four of us are Jewish, right? So like he had to make it possible for us also to have salvation. That's why he came. So if you're still a Christian and believing that, only these are God's, then what are you?
Right.
Sorry.
Well, that's what I mean. It's taken on a racial component because at the end of this thing is materialism. So they have to go back to being this materialist perspective. This is why Israel is now the new God of the Jews. You either have to worship Israel or you are an atheist. Now, here's the big problem.
That's crazy.
During the 1850s, there was a split in Judaism, right? You had the Marxists, you had the secularists splitting off because they were sick and tired of Judaism. The only thing that keeps these two groups, the secular atheistic Jews and the Orthodox, the only thing keeping them together is shared tragedy. So they have to stay in that victimhood mindset so that they can keep their society together. And the only way to keep that victimhood mindset is by constantly reminding them that everyone hates them.
Yeah.
That creates a very bad situation for everybody else. I mean, we have to keep putting up with that because if we don't, somebody's feelings might get hurt.
Okay, let me just jump in here. I have a slightly different perspective, but I don't disagree with anything that either of you said. I just think that there is a deeper layer. I think it goes well beyond ethnicity, well beyond religion. I think that there is like a very esoteric, I know I won't use occult, Headless, okay? I won't use occult. I will try and make a concerted effort to use a different word because I actually think that was a very cogent point. Like, why are we talking about occultism when we should be talking about like the truth? Right. And so I do think there's a deeper layer, and I think that the words that we use, and I'm not putting aspersions on either of you in any way. I'm just saying that the words that we have available to describe what's going on is very insufficient. Yes. And I also think that all races can Kang. Like, you know, the great meme, like we was Kangs. Yeah. But I see a lot of people doing it. Like white people I see doing it. I see black people doing it. I see a lot of people doing the Kanging. So I'll just say that. So I don't think it's limited in its scope of like projecting yourself into a historical past. Now, do I get it in a way? Sure, of course I get it in a way. And I get a lot of shit for being mixed, like all the time, especially from like even people who are like my mutual right-wing bros, and that's totally fine, and I'll take it. Okay, I'll take it. But it's just, I think it is interesting that people get so hung up on like these superficial race concepts rather than, because it goes to the point of what you're saying, Headless. It's like if we didn't really have this tribalistic racial identity, this wouldn't even be a question. Like we could be able to sort of cut through all the bullshit.
The question is, what are you Kanging, right? Are you Kanging a noble ideal or are you Kanging the skin color?
That's right.
You know what I'm saying?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
I love that term though. I'm going to use it.
Okay, go for it.
Seen that before. Well, anything else from all of you, or you think that's real? Like 2 hours now already, so.
Well, I could go into Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve.
That could probably take a while.
You want to hear about that? Okay, well, so Adam and Eve have 3 sons, right? Cain, Abel, and this third guy, Seth, comes after Cain kills Abel. Now, Cain goes out and he's marked, so he's not going to be having sex with his mom, but somebody's got to have sex with his mom because there's only 3 people at this point that are viable. So Seth, I guess, is doing it with Eve, and they make the rest of us, I guess, right? Since we are talking about literalism here, but here's the deeper thing. So Seth in Greek is just Set, right? Set, the donkey-headed god. Now, in Epiphanes' time, which is the guy who was responsible for the desolation of the temple, who went in there with pig's blood, and he sprayed the goddamn thing down with pig's blood because he found that they were fattening up a Greek man so that they could sacrifice him. So he goes in there with pig's blood and he covers all of their books in pig's blood. And this was when they were writing the book of Daniel. So the desolation of the temple in Daniel was actually talking about Epiphanes, this Greek ruler of Syria who went in there and just sprayed everything with pig's blood. So it was like a contemporary accounting of the story of Daniel, while at the same time being, the desolation of this temple. But so during that time period, though, Epiphanes, he ends up getting attacked by the Persians immediately after. And the only other group, place that all of the Jews really lived in was Baghdad, which was like the center for the Persian Empire at that time. So it's funny how he starts doing the abomination desolation in the temple, and then all of a sudden the Persians come and attack him. Perfect timing, right? But then they couldn't get the Persians away, right? The Persians wanted to occupy the place after they killed Epiphanes. So then some strange Jewish merchants found these scrolls that showed that the Spartans, of all people, were actually somehow distantly related to them through the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, probably. And so these Spartans came in free of charge and ridded the place of Persians. So they were really using these stories to maximum effect back then. And a lot of drama became of that because Epiphanes was really interested in recapturing Alexandria. So he just got done in a campaign down there where the Roman ambassador comes up to this guy and says, he makes a big circle around Epiphanes, and he's like, you tell me whether or not you're going to attack Alexandria right now before you leave this circle. And so this old statesman was standing up to a warlord who was about to kill the guy, but he knew that if he killed him, Rome would step in and that would be it. So he almost took Alexandria, which would be the center for all of Egypt, but then he was repelled at the last moment by Rome, and so he went back and decided to mess around with the Jews in Israel. So it's funny, this Epiphanes guy is a really interesting character. He was a really populist kind of president, like what you would think of a Trump to be. He would go around just spreading coins everywhere. Crazy dude.
Trump coins, you could buy him too.
But yeah, it's a perfect example of that. Like, you've got these stories in the Bible that were happening at the same time they were being written, even though they claimed to be, hundreds of years earlier.
Well, I'll add to that, Headless. Is usually your stories are beyond my historical knowledge and definitely geographical. But this time I actually have something. So Seth has a sister in some of the Gnostic works, so the hypostasis of the archons as well as the epinoia of Nuria. So in my opinion, this is where Crowley, Parsons, and Elron got some of the idea for Babylon, is from this idea of the Nuria, the daughter. So she is kind of like the daughter of Adam and Eve, but she's also the sister to Set. And if you read her story, it's really interesting because when she tries to board, one of the stories is that she tries to board Noah's Ark, and she cannot. Noah says no. Noah says, like, you are not a daughter of man, you are a daughter of spirit, but she doesn't really get it. And so he doesn't let her board. So he leaves her on like this rock. And then the archons come down and they try and violate her, basically, is the story. And then, but an angel appears, the Aleph. So it's like a Hebrew letter as well as an angel. So this letter appears, this bright light appears, and he says, stop, to the archons, and then they go away. And he says, you are really a daughter of the spirit. You are the spirit that Eve carried, that Eve originally carried, so like a Sophia kind of thing, like the wisdom within her or hidden light within her. And then she is to propel that forward into the lineage of mankind. So I do think there's like a really interesting way to look at the early Old Testament sort of things with the Gnostic Gospels and sort of put more magical, mystical, and liberatory sort of spin on, how we're taught them, how they are presented to us. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on a thing. I thought that's interesting to bring up.
No, that's a perfect segue, because this Set idea was actually translated in first century slang for Jews and Christians. They were called annulators because they worshipped a donkey. And they knew back then what they were talking about with this whole Set thing. And unfortunately, that was lost to history. They didn't really translate that further on down the line. But there was that annulator angle. And there's a book that was also written in the first century AD called The Golden Ass. And this golden ass was this guy who got transformed into a donkey. And he goes on all these little adventures. It's a crazy book, but there's some sort of linkage between that and Christianity because it was almost explicitly stated, because this guy was actually an Isis worshiper who wrote it. And the entire back half of the book is like first century Isis worship, which you're not going to find that anywhere else. It's just very rich, like incredibly symbolic. But he's talking about Isis and how, she gave him a rose that transformed him back into a man. And there's some sort of a linkage there between mystical Christianity and this book.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also will point out that the donkey is a very common vahana in Buddhism, or vehicle for some of the goddesses to ride. And it actually has a very deep meaning. It is the peace-binding vehicle. So I think that there's something really interesting there when you consider like Mary rode the donkey, like it's the idea of binding this kind of contractual treaty, this covenant, you could say, with
Palm
the North
Sunday.
Star. Exactly. So she's riding it, and then the North Star is in the sky, and the North Star's.
Oh, that sucks.
No,
They just lost him right there.
he was just in the middle of it too.
Yeah, it was in the flow.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of the whole thing was Palm Sunday. As Jesus was riding the donkey, they would lay the palm branches before him. That was highly symbolic.
Oh, he's back. That was quick. He's fast.
Sorry about that.
No,
I don't know what's going on.
fast as hell.
That's so
No,
funny.
so I think there's an interesting correspondence between Isis and Tara, and I think that Tara is probably a Himalayan version of like the Isis, Astarte, some aspects of her Lilith character, and I think it's sort of preserved in that in our thinking. But I also think that the idea of I forgot where I cut off, but I do think that there's something really interesting with the idea of the North Star, the donkey, and Mary riding the donkey, because in some ways of thinking, Mary is both the daughter and the mother, particularly when she's pregnant, because she's also a virgin. Like, whether you believe that or not, irrelevant. What matters is that she, as a virgin, she still represents the wisdom of the daughter, but then she becomes the mother after she gives birth. So there is sort of it's an apotheosis of her story, I think, in some ways.
Look at the Mary of Guadalupe. That is clearly a female sex organ. Like, they put it into that perspective. If you look at the Mary of Guadalupe, it's just like, it's right out there in front of you. What they're saying is, it's like this continuation of womanhood. And that goes back to the M symbol itself. Like, if you think about the oldest glyph for woman has always been the M symbol. And you see it all over. All the M words are very motherly related. You look at Virgo, it's an M. You look at, Scorpio, another M. So the M represents the two legs of the woman as she's giving birth. And that was found in caves like 40,000 years ago. Like, this is very, very old stuff. And you see that the Templars actually tried to make the cathedrals into those M shapes to represent that sort of female goddesshood. And so the entire sort of stretch of Christianity is sort of occulting that female goddesshood, while at the same time kind of overtly kind of putting it in your face if you know that where these origin of the symbols come from.
Well, I don't necessarily think that she is the occulting of the thing, because I think if you grow up Catholic, and I think this is something that American Protestants don't really understand about Catholicism, is there's no worship of Mary. Like, she's never worshipped. She is venerated, and certain people will have a deeper connection to that veneration, because it's like how some people are more attracted to, like, a lot of American Protestants are very attracted to just like the Jesus. It's like that movie Dogma. Some people are attracted to the Jesus with the smiling face and he's doing the guns, the handguns, and some people like that, and some people are going to be more attracted to this Vestal sort of virginal mother figure. And I think that's normal, because in Dharma we say, like, different deities will attract people of different dharmakaya, different minds. Mm-hmm. So I think that is, I actually don't think that they've occulted her. I think they've just, like what Theresa was saying with Jesus, it's like they've continued the story and put her, she is the character to continue that story. She is the one who is the embodiment of that age, or that yuga, or that aeon, or whatever you want to call it. And so that is her. So she doesn't need to represent anyone else. She just needs to represent herself.
Well, I know the Vatican
Okay.
was built on top of a goddess temple.
Can I interject for a second? Okay, so Jin, thank you for bringing that up because personally, okay, we're on the topic of Christian eschatology, right? I have a theory, and a lot of other people share this theory, that maybe in the book of Revelation, the great delusion described is Protestantism. Okay, I'm not here to offend anybody.
I
Okay,
agree with that.
okay, because this is why I think that it's very possible that it is because of the demonization of Mary herself. Because Protestants, they are taught and propagandized to like disgrace to hate her in a way. Like it's shocking how you would talk about the mom of your savior, like anybody's mom, to talk about them like that is nuts. Like you talk about your mom like that or your grandma, are you crazy? Like it's so disrespectful. And I think it's on purpose because
It's used as a tool.
Used as a tool, but I think it's on purpose because if you look at the Marian apparitions and the messages in the Marian apparitions, if you think there's any truth to those messages whatsoever, God's plan she's the new Eve to reconcile what happened in the garden and that God will triumph through the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And that's what he wants. It's not for me to say what he wants. That's what he wants. So for a whole huge section of Christians to despise her,
It's very convenient.
Is a huge mind fuck.
It's
right?
very convenient iconoclasm. Because the very first thing that they're doing is they're going for the Mary figure. They don't care about the Jesus figures, but they want that Mary figure gone. Like that's iconoclasm. They don't want it anywhere around them. And then to come up with the story to say, well, why don't you want it around you? Well, because they're worshiping it over there in the Catholic Church. And it's like, oh, you've got a dichotomy now. This is a great way to divide
and it
people.
divides, exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's almost the total opposite before with the eunuchs.
True, right?
Yeah. She's creative. She's able to give birth to the world. And in Kabbalah, the woman is the world. The daughter is the world, specifically the daughter. And in the book of Revelations, where does the supposed Babylon whore stand? She stands on Yesod. She's on the moon. And when you look at the Christian eschatology pictures, it is Mary holding Christ, standing on the moon, looking at the dragon dragon who's standing on Malkuth, on the earth. He's the avatar of the prince and the principalities. So I totally agree, Theresa. Like I'm on this train. Like it is her that is not the savior, but it is, she's it. So, I do think that there's a big problem in demonizing her. And I do think that if you look at who Martin Luther's backers were, I do think that if you are into parapolitics, if you're into conspiracy, there's something very strange about that. There's something very insidious about it.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Yes.
Now, Martin Luther was a very subversive character. Right? I mean, a lot of people in the Protestant religion try to give him way too much credit because he was, if you look at his seal, it is the symbol for the Rosicrucians. Like it's the same thing. And they had been talking about this sort of Rosicrucian revolution idea for centuries before that. And then, out pops Martin Luther as this sort of Rosicrucian figure. And he, separates out a new church out of the old church. So it drew another division line in Europe. And now you've got a people who were, basically crippled by this iconoclasm of the past. Now, even worse. Now they've got, 100 years wars, 70 years wars, terrible divisions drawn all throughout Europe for what? Because you don't like Mary? Give me a break. That doesn't make any sense.
Also, too, I think that's a big, Nick, a big point of conspiracy. Because a lot of time when you dive down the rabbit hole and you start going, and then you hear the whole argument of like, oh, Mary is just a reincarnation of Isis or Astarte or Catholicism is Tammuz worship, blah, blah, blah. I think, honestly, like that's a whole psyop in itself.
I agree with that.
I fell for that, entertained that for a while myself, and I was like, holy shit, is that was that true? Blah, blah. But anyways, I think it's meant to be a trap along the way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I approach it like it's a eternalism or a perennialist system. So it doesn't matter to me the characters necessarily. Like I don't need to identify them with either historical or whatever. Like it just, they can be who they are, and the cycle plays out, and maybe that doesn't even matter. Maybe the cycle doesn't even matter. Maybe it just matters that how we perceive it. That's sort of what I think. But I'm with you, Theresa. Like I definitely entertain those sort of thinking and was like, wow, did I go really far off? Like with with Catholicism, like my whole life or whatever. Like what was that?
I was like, oh, my whole life was a lie. Tears, right?
But then you realize, like, yeah, there's something beautiful. There's something easy. Like sometimes people have a very easy faith in the religion that they were born in, and I think that that's okay. I actually have begun to be very much more comfortable with that thinking. Like people have a natural connection to what they were raised in rather than fighting against it. Because sometimes I think that is already in our minds. Like that is part of who we are.
Yes.
Well said.
Well, I think that's important because you've got to have the reflections in the right order so that you can get to people on a much deeper level. And this is why esoteric writing, which originated in Greece, you can see it a lot in Plato. He's got esoteric portions of it that make his writings into something more when put through a certain lens. And when it comes to the philology of Greek language, you find that you can get a lot more meanings out of these same words when they're combined in different ways. And you find that in the Bible a lot too. But the problem is, if you don't have a good translation of the Greek, you're never going to actually understand what they're trying to say, because you kind of mold it to fit whatever you want it to mean. And so, that's another big problem with all these translations is you go back to the ancient Greek and you're not looking at the same text.
For sure.
That's why I think discernment is so important, and a lot of Christians will say this word, and I, I'm friends with some of them, but I think that sometimes they forget what that actually means. And I think discernment is really having a textual understanding, and it's not sola scriptura. It's really like looking at, okay, what is the coin? What is the Aramaic? Like what can we look at that's like a textual analog to what we're looking at? And then how did the church fathers think of it? That's what really discernment is, rather than just basing it on your unverified personal gnosis. That's sort of what I think, but I don't know. Maybe that's wrong.
No, I think I see the connection there, but there's a lot of, textual stuff that just gets glossed over, and they don't even try to put it in sort of a context. Like Mark 51 verses 14 and 15, I believe. It's where Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane with a naked boy. And there's really no explanation given why he would be in a cemetery with the naked boy, but it says, and his cloth fell off of his body. And, that's a pretty interesting verse that they would be including there right before his death. He's in the cemetery with the naked boy. And then they just don't mention it again. So... yeah, I can look it up for you.
Sure. I'm just Googling it. Mark 14, verse 51 to 52,
51 and 52,
maybe?
that's right.
With the flax linen.
A young man with nothing but a linen cloth about his body who was seized by the Roman soldiers and ran away naked. It doesn't... It's saying he had a linen cloth on.
Yeah.
I don't know.
A naked boy lost his cloth in the garden with Jesus. You can go to one verse on either side and he'll be like, why are you trying to scandalize me? It's like, wait a second. Is he talking about that boy again? So they just don't really explain this stuff, but I think it explains a lot when we look at the Catholic Church as having sort of secret doctrines. Look at the kind of problems they got into in Boston. Like there might be cults following those verses.
Okay, well, I will just push back a little and just say that linen was a symbol of purity and often associated with angelic beings. And it's saying to reference Ezekiel chapters 9 and 10, Daniel's 10 and 12, and Revelation 15. So I do think that there might be an angelic reference, and it's symbolizing he's wearing the linen cloth as like Adam and Eve wore the fig leaf or whatever. I mean, I know that's more apocryphal.
But you would have to take it as all symbolic at that point, because it's like that's
more of a Catholic. You have to understand, Headless, that is more of a Catholic way to look at it. We don't have a concept of soul. Like I'm saying, Catholics don't really have a concept of sola scriptura. Like it's everything is alliterative, everything's metaphysical. It is not literal.
Even if it was, the way I interpret the verse, it's in the Garden of Gethsemane when Judas betrayed Christ, and it's saying that the man followed him. A young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. I've also heard theories that the man in the scripture is Mark himself, that's like a reference that he was there, and then ran away out of fear. I don't think it's implying that like Jesus was doing weird shit with a naked dude. That's just not how I interpret the verse personally.
If there is some sort of a connection there, I think that, it would have to look back at things like institutionalized pedophilia, because I don't think that's a new invention,
No, but I think maybe those who did the crucifying might have more of a history of that.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, but it comes from that source, So there's a connection between the source and the thing that they produced. Like, for instance, in 70 AD, when Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans, they all fled down into the Arabian Peninsula, right? This is 70 AD. And several hundred years later, you get the emergence of Islam. And Islam becomes the sort of linkage there between this new form of Judaism. You've got Christianity, which is the new form of Judaism there, and then Islam, which becomes the new Judaism over in Saudi Arabia. And there was 6 Kaabas, right? The big black stone that they have that they dance around. Well, there were 6 of them originally, but after Islam took over and took away the paganism from Arabia, which was actually the most peaceful, well-connected society in history.
Back on the Headless, because I know you said this last time. We have Chinese travel journals from this time, from Xuanzang, Tang and Song Dynasty travel journals, hundreds of them still exist, easily translatable from classical into traditional characters. So they do not agree with this interpretation that it was a peaceful society. I will say that because after the last show, I made sure I looked it up because I had read those in my undergrad years a million years ago. They did not agree. And the Silk Road was much more syncretic. Like a lot of these people were hanging around with each other. Like if you go to Azerbaijan now, they have the Living Flame Temple. That was frequented by Buddhists. They had Brahmin priests, Hindus. They had Zoroastrians. They had Nestorian Christians. But the one people that they did not include was pagans, because the pagans were considered to have these very virulent sort of blood rites. And so any kind of sacrifice to the flame was considered to pollute the flame, because in Zoroastrianism, the flame is the tongue or the sometimes the eye of God. So I just will say that. But I'm not saying that your interpretation is wrong. I think that there are multiple sort of cultural ways to look at that.
Okay, well, in this context, I'm just going off of their history with their neighbors. So they were never invaded by Rome. They were always considered friends. They were never invaded by Greece because the Greeks actually liked their perspective. So they weren't really at war with any of the dominant areas at the time, because they maintained a very peaceful, honest relationship, at least with the Greeks and Romans. So at that time, though, when Islam took over, they were able to spread out over the globe extremely fast because they had already set up these trading networks, right? So the rapid expansion into Europe through Spain was because of the fact that they had already set up massive trade routes all throughout the region. They were known as, the world's best traders. And for that reason, they had, vast amounts of wealth. But, after Islam took over, all that wealth really stuck to the top. And there was really, they've been poor pretty much ever since, despite the fact that they had, generational wealth coming from all of the areas in old Persia and all of the areas, all over the desert regions. And all that wealth just basically evaporated. And it hasn't ever come back since. It's kind of funny like that.
States are very wealthy. So, I mean, there is wealth there. And it just is, I think that, Islamic banking rules, as has been mentioned before, are very similar to ESG and some of the, globalist agenda things. And so I do think that there's definitely a close link, but I personally am more skeptical of this peaceable Arabian history, just because I am familiar with this other version, but I don't know. So maybe it could be both true.
Well, they could be peaceful with two groups and maybe not one other, but that goes back to ancient feuds. And this is the region for ancient feuds. My God, they still hate each other from thousands and thousands of years ago. So that ancient feuding angle is a real one too, as well. But,
totally. But I will say about the Kabbas, like, I have never heard about the six, but I think in the metaphysical terms, I would not say the Kabbas are good. Like, I don't usually place good and evil particulars onto things, but I would say the Kabbas are capture devices, kind of, and like black cubes, like that's what it is. It's to capture some essence of God, the lightning strike.
In ancient times, these Kabbas would be placed at oases, and they would represent all of the gods from all the surrounding cultures in them. So when he destroyed all the other Kabbas, it was because he dedicated that one to Allah, this new god that they had formed from other sources, and that Allah was the only one allowed to be, in existence. So when they smashed the other Kabbas that were basically oases of friendship, like this was for everybody traveling along these routes to pray and worship, they kind of centralized all that power and authority into Mecca. And so they beheaded everybody else.
The Kabbas have the goddesses still enshrined, like the yonis, like they have the 7 meteorite yonis with the silver sort of exterior layer on the side, just like a chakra system sort of. And so they still have that there. So I don't know if it, like you're saying that it would be open to people to pray, but from like the Chinese perspective, the Arabian tribes were like untamable. So I mean, I'm just saying that I think that there are different cultural interpretations on that story.
Well, there's a wide range of these type of trader networks too. There's so many different ones along the route that would pick up where the others left off. It was a long way. But I think we're wrapping up now, I think. Do you guys have any
Oh, you know what I wanted to toss in there real quick before so many people started jumping off. Stickers. I got free stickers to send out. I got a bunch of stickers in. If you want some, just send me either email the nypatriot1978 @gmail, or hit me up on like either Instagram or Twitter, and send me somewhere to put them, to send them, and they're free. If you're willing to slap some up and like tag them in areas, I'll give you more. If you walk around in your area or in cities, if you started paying attention, you'd probably be surprised how many weird fucking stickers there are in areas of graffiti, to where it's like I've even started wondering, like, is these like occultists like throwing up I don't know, very weird stuff I've seen put on stickers in weird areas. So toss them up. If it's any, I guess, an interest to people, Darby O'Trill is the one who did create the art. That might be of like some interest to some people, because I have had like, not for nothing, it's actually pretty interesting. In like the last probably like 2 months, a lot of I guess, fan mail that I've been getting. 90% of it has been from juggalos, believe it or not. So it's actually been pretty impressive how many of them have either DM'd me or actually emailed me to tell me how much they like the show. And they think it's badass.
Nice.
So maybe to the juggalos out there, Dario Trill made this art. So if you want some free stickers that he made, hit me up and I will throw them out to you. So yeah, I did want to bring that up before we wrapped it up for people. So yeah.
Also, I just started a Patreon account, so I'm going to be focusing mainly on tarot and Reiki services. So if you guys like tarot, Reiki, and guided meditations, it's going to be focused mainly on that. So if you guys are interested, check it out. Patreon.com/Headless Giant.
Awesome. Definitely check that out. Very interesting. Theresa, Theresa, you want to plug your show real quick? Oh, you want to announce, like, kind of like, not putting you on the spot here, but
Yeah,
I already
sure.
said that.
So, yes, Spiritual Gangsters is where you can find me. So Nick and I are sort of resurrecting our Clown World segment that we used to do, where we talk about current events and like pop culture. So basically, it's going to be like on a miniature scale, so not as like intense. It used to be every week and like 10 to 12 like news stories. Like, it's just too intense for me. So a miniature version of that is going to start, I think, next Friday. We're going to do it live. Friday nights, I'm party.
Yes. Definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Should be fun.
Yeah,
Awesome.
for sure.
Yeah, and actually, real quick too, not to take up too much time. I mean, I don't want to jinx it, but I mean, I'm pretty sure it will happen. Probably like within a month or so, me and JJ might actually start doing like a bi-weekly thing as well on
Nice.
during the day on Tuesdays. So and it's probably more of like him bringing topics to the show, honestly, but it should be pretty interesting. I know some people do like his style, so that's something to look out to, a change in the show as well.
Yeah.
And Jen, let everybody know where they can find your amazing work.
Sure. So thanks, guys. Let me just say that I know I talked a lot this episode. I apologize.
No,
Thank
that's
you,
good.
Nick. Thank you, Theresa. Thank you, HG. Really great. You can find me on Twitter, or X, Wukong Reborn, WUKONG Reborn. My show, Threshold Saints, Spotify and Anchor. Tracy Twyman Part 2 will be out in the next 2 days. I was supposed to come out today, 22nd, but I just was slow. So I apologize for that. But it is coming out. And Sunday, we will be doing the first reading from our book club, our Grey Lodge book club on Twitter. So if you want to listen in, you can follow me and you'll see it and you can join. And we're reading Inner Secrets of Taoism, Part 1. So nothing too heavy. We're just going to start out all equals. It's a big group of 60 people. I couldn't even believe it. And yeah, I don't even know where they came from, honestly.
From Twitter.
So yeah, so we're doing that. So that's what I'm up to.
Awesome.
Very nice.
Hell yeah. Very nice, man. Oh, when is that Pico episode going to drop?
Okay, so I'm recording with Greg on Sunday. So hopefully,
okay.
I think I labeled, he loves 9s. So I gave him 27.
Oh, very nice.
So
I highly suggest for the listeners, because I covered him and like one or two other people in one show. It was just kind of like a basic brief history of the man, because I think he's someone of interest. I would highly suggest the listeners to go check out this show if it's going to be specifically on him. He is somebody I suggest to go learn more about. It's just my opinion.
Awesome.
So,
thanks, Nick.
Of course. Yo, that was a banger. The four-headed beast brought it again. I had a good time. We all had, possibly different perspectives on things on that, and I thought it was an interesting chat. We all acted like grown-ups, and so did everybody else in the live chat, too. It was amazing. And I like how that happens on the Occult Rejects. Because if we're going to sit here and
fires.
Yeah, right?
No fires.
If we don't sit here and argue and bicker, we might actually get somewhere. So,
Right.
I love it. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Headless, for bringing the topic up. By the way.
100%.
Definitely.
It was a
Thank you.
great
Yeah, this
talk.
is good. I think this is so topical because,
It is.
like I said, we got to re-examine these beliefs. At the very core is a value system. And that's what the problem is all of these differing beliefs change the value system. And then the values compete against each other. We need to have principles, not just values.
And you know what, as an occultist, I'm just going to put it this way too. When you, like, I would even say reevaluate, like, even if you're a religious person, I'm not saying to stop the religion, maybe look at it a little bit more deeper. As an occultist, just for me, my opinion, looking at the way I look at it, honestly, it's much more of a beautiful idea than it was prior to I got into magic. I could say I actually respect the Bible more now than I did when I thought I was fucking reading it. You know, I mean, just for real shit. So, like, you know, maybe it's just a little bit deeper than most people think. You know, not saying it has any less value. I think it makes it more beautiful. So
It's
just think of
written in
that.
Koine. There has to be some esoteric element to it because that's where it comes from.
Yeah. All right, awesome. Thank you all again, and again to the chat, the live chat. That's why I go live. We had awesome chats in there. We had a lot of stuff added. Thank you very much again. And that is the end of another Occult Rejects. Until the next one, everybody be well. Later.